Minister.
Organized by the Portuguese Presidency of the Council of the European Union and the program Nunca Esquecer, Never Forget. We thank you for your participation and hope this conference can be an opportunity to promote and mobilize support for the initiatives undertaken by different stakeholders working on these matters, and to provide an overview of existing policies and programs and identify main trends and emerging concerns. Please join me in welcoming the Portuguese Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, Francisco André, who will now open the conference.
Speakers and moderators for joining us today and for your relentless work in promoting and protecting all human rights of all persons, in particular of those facing discrimination. Let me also greet everyone attending the conference, and a special thanks for Michelle Bachelet for her message and work. The fight against all forms of discrimination is a priority for the Portuguese government and for the Portuguese Presidency of the European Union. Today's event is one of the key initiatives of our presidency. It takes place 1 month after the first European Anti-Racism Summit, co-hosted by the European Commission and the Portuguese Presidency in cooperation with the Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup of the European Parliament. The summit was a milestone to kick off the implementation of the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan adopted last year. This plan has been discussed in the EPSCO meeting last March, together with the strategy for LGBTQ equality, the strategy for gender equality, and the Roma strategic framework. In the same way, the European recommendation of Roma equality, inclusion, and participation for the next decade has also been approved last month. Because the Portuguese presidency, as one of its major goals to push forward a union for equality, wants to reinforce the idea of a European Union where all citizens are equal and equally treated. The European Union has in fact been improving its internal as well as external action frameworks to prevent and fight racial discrimination and related intolerance. The 2020 and 2024 European Union Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy is another good example. In Portugal, we have established earlier this year a working group composed by experts and civil society organizations to assess the national situation, reflect on existing mechanisms, identify priority areas and needs, and prepare a set of proposals to fight racism and discrimination. The outcome is currently under public consultation until mid-May, and it will be subsequently adopted as the first ever national plan against racism and discrimination. In the same way, the Never Forget program, our partner in the organization of this conference, was launched in June 2020 and aims to raise awareness and promote research and knowledge about the Holocaust and human rights, namely the work of the Portuguese that have provided protection to support the victims and survivors of the Nazi regime, such as the Portuguese diplomats Aristides Sousa Mendes, Carlos Sampaio Garrido, or Teixeira Branquinho. Let us be clear, racial and other forms of discrimination reveal themselves in often diffuse and subtle ways. Stereotypes and prejudices perpetuate historical and structural discrimination models that are built on the idea that some persons are superior to others. Though the fights against anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and anti-Gypsyism have their own specificities, they are all strands of action of a common journey to equality and non-discrimination, cornerstone values of democratic societies. The promise of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, remains crucial. Racial discrimination, including related intolerance, is a human rights violation. It is an affront to human dignity. There is no valid biological, political, or cultural superiority argument that justifies them. In some countries, anti-discrimination legal frameworks are inexistent or still not aligned with international human rights instruments. This needs to change. even in countries where there have been significant legislative developments, violations and abuses persist. Additionally, there is also the need to close the gap between legal framework and social practice. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated inequalities and is having a negative impact in the realization of human rights. In addition, the pandemic situation has fueled polarization in the communities and has been a fertile ground and an escalation of discriminatory and xenophobic speech and practices. We have seen incitement to hate speech and violence rising online and offline, and just as the pandemic spreading all over the world. Consequently, this exacerbates segregation, insecurity, social exclusion, isolation, and stigmatization of persons that were already in a vulnerable situation. It compromises social cohesion and development. It is a dangerous trend. Civil society organizations, in particular, those representing the communities that face racial discrimination and related intolerance, are crucial partners in ensuring a more inclusive, cohesive, and democratic society. Human rights education, history teaching, research, and the media can also have an important role in fighting hate speech by fostering awareness, critical thinking, and contributing to empower rights holders. Opportunities of exchange of views also contribute to a better understanding of the discriminatory realities, and that is our expectation for this conference. Thank you.
We will now follow up with a message from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, addressing the United Nations' role in this field and the efforts and actions taken by the High Commission in this regard.
Minister Santos Silva, Vice President Skinas, distinguished participants, colleagues, friends, I am pleased to join you in this conference. Last year was an important global milestone against the scourge of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Across Europe and the world, we saw an uprising of anti-racist movements and human rights defenders, among them many young people who courageously took to the streets demanding racial justice, equity, equality, and human rights for all. After decades of struggle, their voices have been heard. I am encouraged that worldwide, at many different levels, significant steps are being taken to address systemic racial discrimination and related intolerance. In that regard, there are several encouraging measures recently taken by the European Union. That includes the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan 2020-2025, which calls on all of its member states to adopt national action plans against racism by next year, as well as the declaration on mainstreaming the fight against anti-Semitism across policy areas in various levels of government. I also welcome the EU Roma strategic framework to fight against anti-Gypsyism and promote truth and reconciliation, as well as the related recommendation by the EU Council in early March. I also commend the first EU commemoration of the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery last December and the subsequent discussions on the legacy of colonialism and the slave trade, especially on recognizing the past, repairing the present, and building the future. I encourage you to continue the crucial work of addressing the root causes of racial discrimination and related intolerance in partnership with concerned communities and civil societies. Colleagues, the killing of George Floyd has become emblematic of the pattern of racial injustice faced by people of African descent in many countries across the globe. In June 2021, I will present a report on systemic racism and use of force violations by law enforcement, pursuant to the Human Rights Council's request. The report will present a transformative agenda for racial justice, which I hope will contribute to assisting states to dismantle systemic racism, to end impunity for police violence, to reimagine policing and reform the criminal justice system, and confront the legacies of the past by adopting measures to achieve reparatory justice. The human rights situation of Roma worldwide has also long been a matter of serious concern. For centuries, they have faced discrimination, social exclusion, and marginalization in all areas of life. The alarming rise of hate speech and scapegoating against the Roma in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic is particularly troubling. My office has issued guidelines in response to widespread reports of violence in addition to several other discrimination-based negative impacts of COVID-19 on different minority groups. In all of them, the core message is state must place human rights at the center of response and recovery efforts. Behind today's manifestations of anti-Gypsyism, like other forms of hatred and discrimination, lies a failure to acknowledge and confront the legacy of the past, which is fundamental to achieving genuine inclusion, reconciliation, and social cohesion. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the International Roma Day. My office is strongly committed to working together with Roma civil society and other partners in strengthening the protection of their human rights. We will continue to speak out against anti-Gypsyism and support efforts to secure the genuine inclusion of Roma in societies across the globe. Anti-Semitism also poses a threat to all societies. A recent survey from the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights found that 9 in 10, that means 89%, responded feel that anti-Semitism increased in their country, and more than 8 in 10, 85%, consider it to be a serious problem. Indeed, the past year has seen an increase in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Europe. Under international law, people are entitled to legal protection from incitement to hatred and violence. The rise in attacks targeting Jews, Muslims, or other groups targeted because of their race or religion is gravely concerning. 20 years ago, the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance in Durban acknowledged and profoundly regretted the untold suffering and evils inflicted on millions of men, women, and children, victims of slavery, the slave trade, apartheid, and genocide. They also agreed on the need for justice and to address the legacy of these crimes against humanity, including current manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. I joined the Special Rapporteur on Racism, the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, another Durban follow-up mechanism, who are calling for reparatory justice. This requires making amends for centuries of violence and discrimination, including through formal apologies, truth-telling processes, and reparations in various forms. Meaningful apologies require a genuine acknowledgement of responsibility for wrongdoing by the state. It is important to ensure that the process for addressing historical crimes starts with comprehensive and inclusive consultations with those affected by the inflicted harms. This year's midterm review of the International Decade for People of African Descent is also an opportunity for states to renew their commitment to address the root causes and current manifestations of racism. The International Decade provides an important framework for taking action on structural issues of access to justice, racial profiling, and recognition of both the contributions of people of African descent and the deep-seated socio-economic disparity that affect them. We must now conclude negotiations to establish the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent and develop a United Nations Declaration on the promotion and full respect of human rights of people of African descent in full collaboration with people of African descent. As the coordinator of the International Decade, I welcome steps taken by the co-facilitators towards the establishment of the Permanent Forum this year. We must seize this moment to address historical injustices and combat impunity for racial discrimination and related intolerance. For that, we must implement international human rights norms and standards. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination and the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, DDPA, are internationally agreed commitments against racial discrimination in all spheres of life. They commit states to take targeted steps in law, in policy, and in practice to ensure full and equal rights to those who have faced discrimination in the past and today. The Declaration details actions that states should take in collaboration with parliaments, national institutions, civil society, and other partners. It also contemplates strategies of enhanced international cooperation and mainstreaming, which involve the United Nations and other international mechanisms. As you are aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and magnified racial discrimination and inequalities on a wide scale. So we must recover better. The first step is adopting a human rights-based approach to recovery that puts people at the center of all efforts. Recovering better will require concerted efforts to rebuild trust in the institutions of governance. We renew commitment to eliminating racism and racial discrimination, promoting meaningful participation and accountability, and protecting fundamental freedoms. We must bridge the gap between law and policy and take concrete actions to implement these commitments with adequate resources and effect real change. Policies and programs need to use disaggregated data in order to identify who is being left behind. The situation is urgent and we must act now. My office stands ready to support all efforts to eliminate the root causes of racial discrimination and related intolerance, to make real progress towards equality and human rights for all. Thank you very much.
Closing our opening session, it is our honor to introduce the Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Margaritis Sines, to discuss the EU's role and responsibilities in the fight against racism and other forms of intolerance.
Excellencies, dear Secretary of State, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is both a great pleasure and an honor to be with you today, especially following the inspiring message by High Commissioner Bachelet. I would like first to thank and congratulate the Portuguese Presidency for putting the spotlight on the protection from racial discrimination and related forms of intolerance. The coronavirus put our societies all under enormous strain, and it revealed what is best in us: solidarity, altruism, unconditional support to family members, friends, neighbors, and strangers. But at the same time, it also unveiled some of the worst scourges that humanity has still not managed to eradicate. Centuries-old superstitions and conspiracy theories and myths. It ignited xenophobic, racist, and anti-Semitic rhetoric, online and offline, especially about the origin of the virus, its spread, miracle cures. And these phenomena fueled in our societies an us versus them mentality, causing great harm to our societies in a way that can unfortunately long outlast the pandemic itself. I want to be very clear that for us here in the European Union, responding decisively to this creeping threat is not just a question of moral duty. It is existential. This European Commission has made the fight for equality and non-discrimination a central pillar of our work. As High Commissioner Bachelet reminded us, only last year, this Commission adopted the first ever EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, which brings together policies against racism and brings the protection at the next level, mobilizing all tools at our disposal. We are stepping up action against racism, not only with better rules, but with considerable European new funding possibilities, with police cooperation, with our education policy, with external action, and much more. For the next 7 years, we will have a new self-standing citizens' equality, rights, and values program, which will seek to protect and promote open, rights-based, democratic, equal, and inclusive societies based on the rule of law. This new program will rely on a spectacular budgetary increase from 640 million euros to 1.55 billion euros, making this instrument the biggest ever EU program for supporting fundamental rights inside the EU. Of course, we are not starting from zero. Back in 2008, the framework decision on combating racism and xenophobia criminalized for the first time hate crime and hate speech, and defined as public incitement to violence or hatred on the basis of certain characteristics, including race, color, religion, descent, national or ethnic origin. And through our high-level group on combating racism and xenophobia, established 8 years later in 2016, the Commission has provided guidance to national authorities on how to step up the enforcement of this framework decision, in particular concerning the support to victims of hate crime, training of law enforcement officers, hate speech online, and data collection. We are determined to ensure its full and correct implementation. Regarding specifically the fight against hate speech online, the Commission identified already and initiated back in 2016 a code of conduct with the major online platforms, which is now yielding positive results. We have seen removal rates go up from only 28% in our first monitoring to a now stable removal rate above 70%. Today, almost 90% of the notices are reviewed within the 24 hours prescribed by the Code of Conduct. And this Code of Conduct is signed and effectively followed by Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Dailymotion, Snapchat, jeuxvideo.com, and TikTok. In addition, in December last year, we adopted a proposal for a Digital Services Act, which looks closer at the platform's liability and sets out a comprehensive approach towards all forms of illegal content online. The Digital Services Act is the European way for digital governance and makes legally binding some aspects which are already part of the voluntary code of conduct, such as putting in place notice and action mechanism and the cooperation with trusted flaggers on content moderation. Parallel to all this, we have also invested significantly in tailor-made approaches to address the vulnerabilities of specific groups or communities that are particularly exposed to hatred and intolerance. The EU Roma Strategic Framework for Equality, Inclusion and Participation, adopted in October last year, is a very pertinent example. It defines the EU and our member states' policies in this area for the next 10 years to prevent and fight against anti-Gypsyism, discrimination, segregation in education and housing, anti-Roma prejudice and stereotypes. Parallel to that, we promote the inclusion of both migrants and EU citizens with a migrant background with a comprehensive action plan for inclusion and integration we presented in November last year. These persons are often affected by discrimination and racism in their daily lives at school, at work, and in the neighborhood. Our plan foresees precisely a wide range of actions in key areas of our societies and public services, from education to employment to health and housing. And it recognizes the specific challenges facing religious communities, and work will continue also on that front, especially with the determination to the position against anti-Muslim heritage and anti-Semitism, on which I would like to say a few words. Stepping up the fight against anti-Semitism is an integral part of my portfolio as Vice President, one that I accepted with a great sense of honor and responsibility. According to the overview published by our Fundamental Rights Agency in September, more than 3,000 anti-Semitic incidents were recorded across the EU in 2019. It is worth noting that this concerns a community that accounts for less than 0.5% of the EU population. And these figures are unfortunately only the tip of the iceberg. During the German presidency of the Council, we placed renewed focus on the efforts to combat this scourge of anti-Semitism, culminating in the adoption of a first ever declaration on mainstreaming the fight against anti-Semitism as a cross-cutting issue in all policy areas. I'm truly grateful to the Portuguese presidency for continuing to keep this issue high up on the political agenda. And recently, 3 of our member states adopted targeted national strategies on anti-Semitism. 4 more are in the process of doing so, while 7 others are introducing specific measures on anti-Semitism in their general anti-racism strategies. In addition, 18 of our EU member states have already adopted the working definition of anti-Semitism by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which has proven to be a valuable tool for practitioners to identify and address contemporary forms of anti-Semitism in a coordinated and uniform way. On the side of the Commission, we have announced, and I'm proud to reconfirm this commitment, that we will present later this year the first ever European strategy on anti-Semitism. It will provide a comprehensive framework to complement and support member states' effort on preventing and combating anti-Semitism, educating on the Holocaust remembrance, and fostering Jewish life in Europe. It will bring together in a holistic manner the various EU policy areas in line with the Council declaration, namely security, education, data collection, integration measures, inclusion, and international aspects. Let me be very clear. 3/4 of a century after the Shoah, the symbolic, political, and substantive significance of this European initiative cannot be overstated. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, when President von der Leyen entrusted me with a portfolio of promoting our European way of life, you would remember that a long debate ensued on how exactly this European way of life could be defined. To me, from the very start, there has never been any doubt. As I said already at my hearing in the European Parliament, the treaty reminds us that the European Union is founded on the respect for human dignity in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. This is the essence. This is the DNA of our union, defending the simple but essential premise that everybody matters in Europe, that none should be left behind, and that all should have access to the same rights, securities, and opportunities. As the President herself stressed a few days ago at the European Anti-Racism Summit, this is the kind of Europe we want to build. And this is our mission, making good on Europe's promise for all Europeans. Thank you.
It is now time to begin the discussion with our first session. We will have the privilege to count on the contribution of the European Commission Coordinator on Combating Anti-Semitism and Fostering Jewish Life, Katharina von Schnurbein, the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Ahmed Shahid, and the Executive Director of Europol, Catherine de Boule. The moderation will be handled by Ambassador José Filipe Moraes Cabral, who will direct the discussion and pick some questions from the chat at the end of each intervention. The panel's discussion will focus on exploring the topic of hate speech linked to the role that human rights education, media, and history teaching can play in countering online and offline.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary of State, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to you all and welcome to the first panel discussion of the Conference on Protection Against Discrimination and Related Intolerance, organized by the Portuguese Presidency of the European Union as one of the several initiatives aiming at the promotion of European values, democracy and equality, as our Secretary of State just mentioned. In the present panel, we will be discussing ways of countering hate speech and specifically the role human rights education, the teaching of history, and the media can have in countering it, both online and offline. As the Secretary General of the United Nations stated when he launched the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech 2 years ago, and I quote, "We are seeing a disturbing groundswell of xenophobia, racism, and intolerance, including rising anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred, and persecution of Christians, with social media and other forms of communication being exploited as platforms of bigotry." He further underlines that hate is moving into the mainstream, both in liberal democracies and authoritarian systems, and that hate speech is indeed a very great threat to democratic values, social stability, and peace. To address this issue, as was already mentioned, we have the pleasure of having with us three particularly distinguished panelists with a wide experience in countering hate speech, racial discrimination, and intolerance in defending and promoting human rights. Katharina von Schnurbein is the coordinator on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life in the European Commission, the first appointed such coordinator, with the specific task of proposing and implementing European policy to prevent and fight anti-Semitism. Before taking on her present position in December 2015, Ms. von Schnurbein was for 5 years an advisor to Commission President Barroso on the dialogue with churches, religions, and non-confessional organizations. Previously, she was press officer for the EU delegation in Prague and later one of the spokespersons for the Czech European Commissioner, Vladimir Špidla. Ahmed Shahid will also join us, I believe, from London. Mr. Shahid is a special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Before taking on these responsibilities in November 2016, he was a special rapporteur of the Human Rights Council on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. He is the Deputy Director of the Essex Human Rights Centre and held twice the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs of Maldives, and from 2003 to 2011 he led this country's efforts to embrace international human rights standards. He holds a number of international awards in recognition of his work in the fields of human rights and democracy. The third participant in our panel is Catherine de Beau, who has been since May 2018 the Executive Director of Europol. Before that, Mr. de Beau held a number of important positions and responsibilities, namely as member of the Executive Committee of Interpol, President of the Coordination Committee for Intelligence and Security, and General Commissioner of the Belgian Federal Police between 2012 and 2018. Previously, she was Chief of the Police in the city of Ninove and legal expert and officer with the Belgian Gendarmerie. She has also been a member of the Police Reform Commission and of the Federal Police Council of Belgium, as well as of the Standing Committee on Operational Cooperation on Internal Security of the European Union. I again thank all three for your participation and we'll start with, if you allow me, Katharina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chairman, Ambassador Cabral, and big thanks to the Portuguese Presidency and Minister Santos Silva for putting this important topic of addressing hate speech high on the agenda during the EU Presidency, and to Nunca Sakusur and Never Forget for organizing this event. I believe that we have heard already from the excellent introductory remarks how complex the issue is of addressing hate speech online, and I would add also conspiracy myths, because we have seen that, especially also during the COVID pandemic, not only hate speech, outright hate speech has increased, but also conspiracy myths that are not necessarily illegal, but can be very harmful, and in fact have led in the past to terrorist attacks, such as the attack on the synagogue in Halle, or also the shisha bar in Hanau, and many other places across Europe. We believe at the European Commission that you need to have a holistic approach in order to address hate speech online. And that means, on the one side, as Vice President Skinas has just pointed out, on a European level, have a framework for this data highway that will help and regulate certain aspects with regards to transparency and takedown, but also in particular responsibilize the platforms in recognizing their not only responsibility, but also the power they have. They are not simply postmen delivering messages. They know the content, they have algorithms, and it is important that these aspects are recognized and also regulated to a certain extent. The other important actors in this are the national law enforcement authorities and the lawmakers in transposing legislation from European level, ensuring that it is properly applied, and that the different actors on national level interact with each other, and also on European level and globally. In fact, we know that the haters are very well connected often, even if it's only in bubbles and it's not formal networks, and they interact while it sometimes seems that as policymakers, we're often a step behind. So it's very important to ensure that we use all these instruments at hand to address hate speech and also other forms of hatred on the net. Finally, it's also very important that the users themselves are responsibilized. They need to be empowered. It's not easy to counter hatred on the net or to debunk a conspiracy myth, but it is necessary. And we, for example, at the European Commission, together with UNESCO, in July last year, created a Twitter campaign which was called Think Before Sharing, in order to debunk conspiracy myths that had developed in the dovetailing the COVID pandemic. And we thought that it was very important to ensure that users have certain instruments and certain websites, also logos and things at hand with which they can flag or address or question conspiracy myths. And I think that these four elements, the European level, the national level, and the platform responsibility and users, have to work together in order to ensure a proper response. I believe what is important to see, and the question today is, how can actually hate speech be countered by teaching of history of human rights, which in a way is a challenge. It has become a challenge on the one side because there is a lack of knowledge with regards to the facts. For example, the framework decision that was already mentioned by Vice President Skinas on racism and xenophobia, which was adopted in 2008, criminalizes Holocaust denial and condoning the Holocaust, trivializing the Holocaust across the EU. And what is illegal offline is also illegal online. And therefore, whenever there are attempts of Holocaust denial and also the, Holocaust distortion, it should be addressed by authorities in the end, by law enforcement authorities, but also users should be able to recognize it. And we know from the surveys that in fact, the level of knowledge about the Holocaust, what it was about, is very low among, in particular, young people and those who use the net. We have seen horrific types of Holocaust denial and distortion on platforms such as TikTok, for example, also Facebook, where young people are, TikTok more so than Facebook is already more my generation, I think, where simply the users don't recognize that a certain allusion to Auschwitz, somebody coming out of a shower, making a remark about Auschwitz, or these kind of things, that there is a connection, because in fact only 10% of 15-year-olds can still name a concentration camp. So there is a big responsibility for the education system, for the national system, but also with regards to the international organizations that often can supply certain material and also help member states not to reinvent the wheel in every instance, but to use material that can be used for teachers in the different school systems, for example, and also to train the trainers. And in order to do that, I believe it is necessary that not only we address the challenges of direct teaching and making sure that in a very diverse society, where sometimes there are, for example, children that have no connection of their family anymore, or of their own history with the Holocaust, and therefore don't necessarily see the reason or the necessity why this should actually be should responsibilize them. I believe it's important to understand that the Holocaust was a question for humanity as such, and understanding how it came about and what it led to and how this could happen in the center of civilized Europe can have a tremendous impact on critical thinking, on responsibilizing and also creating civil courage that will help them to stand up against hate speech and conspiracy on the net. I believe we also have to take into account that as those who hold the testimonies and that survived the Holocaust will in a short while no longer be with us, we have to find new ways of how to relate the Holocaust to younger people, and to ensure in the next 25 years that there will be a transformation and a handing down this knowledge beyond those who still have a connection to it because their grandparents lived it and could still talk about it. There is also a more general issue of the fact that in the digital sphere, young people act differently than and the changes of action change very quickly. This will also mean that we need to find ways to commemorate and educate about the Holocaust in this world, and also take into account, for example, the fact that the concentration span of young people can be shorter than we have been used to. all of this together, I believe that it is very important, and I use this example of the Holocaust, but there are many other examples that can be important for other minorities. It is important to transmit the facts on the one side, but it is also important to find ways to relate this to young people and to responsibilize all the different actors in order to push back on hate speech online. We know that the internet has brought tremendous good, but it has also become the challenge for all of us, for all users, with regards to hate speech and hate speech that can play into the real world. And therefore, it's very important that we address this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katharina von Schnurbein. I'm very impressed with what you said. When you mentioned specifically that the level of knowledge of the Holocaust is very low, albeit all the efforts that have been done, this indeed underlines the importance of history and of knowledge of history and of education. And I personally believe that is the way we should go forward, because it's not a repressive type of framework that will help us in that. And let me also underline what you mentioned, that inevitably those that knew personally of the Holocaust won't be with us much longer. So we must find new ways of conveying this knowledge and this awareness to the younger generations, to young people. You know, what he said strikes a very particular chord in me, because I lived most of my life under a dictatorship. But now, when you talk to younger Portuguese, and they don't really realize that we lived for 50 years under a dictatorship, and it was not so long ago. So this is a very wide, very tall order. But I think the key, and I agree with you, is on education, on transparency, and knowledge of history. Now let's move on. Mr. Shahid, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Honorable Chair, fellow panelists, and distinguished participants. I am delighted to join this important conference today and this panel, and want to begin by thanking the Portuguese Presidency of the European Union for inviting me to speak today. Throughout my mandate as UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, I have explored how rising intolerance towards minorities affect the enjoyment of the right to freedom of religion or belief worldwide, and recommended measures in line with international human rights law. Unfortunately, hate speech in particular is a theme that repeatedly features in my work. People of all faiths and none have spoken to me about their concerning experiences of hate speech, whether in person or online, which create a sense that they are unsafe and unwelcome in these spaces and feel that they must conceal their identity for their safety and that of their families and communities. This threatens their enjoyment of the right to freedom of religion or belief and undermines their free and equal participation in society. Rising numbers of hate crimes committed against minorities worldwide are often incited and aggravated by online hate speech. While different communities are affected in different ways, the perpetrator spreading the hate is often the same or similar. Studies show that where someone is intolerant towards one specific group, this often corresponds with intolerance towards others. And as I observe in my previous reports, there's an alarming increase of right-wing extremist groups that peddle misinformation and conspiracy myths about religious or belief minorities, increasingly transcend borders by propagating hate online, as we have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the dissemination of narratives of religious intolerance is not confined to fringe groups. For example, harmful stereotypes and tropes about different minority communities have been reinforced by mainstream media, politicians, and other public figures, as well as in academic discourse. It is also important to note that surges in online hate speech are often catalyzed by offline trigger events, such as terror attacks, including attacks on the very community that is there targeted by online hate. Comments from public figures or political events such as elections or referenda. It is imperative to listen to the voices of those with lived experiences of hate speech phenomenon and develop appropriate tools in accordance with the human rights framework. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of racist and religious bigotry and hate are often intersectional in nature, such as people are targeted not only based on their actual or perceived belief identity, but also on their race, ethnicity, nationality, and gender, amongst other grounds. Indeed, the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan 2020-2025 has highlighted that different forms of racism that link to religion or belief in cases such as anti-Muslim and anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred and anti-Semitism. My reports, the UN have recommended that the use of existing UN-linked tools to tackle hate speech, including the follow-up mechanism to the Human Rights Council Resolution 1618, namely the Istanbul process, to build societal cohesion against hatred. At the national level, it is important that governments introduce and enforce relevant legislation against acts that lead to incitement to discrimination and violence against people based on their identity, and promote opportunities for interfaith engagement, communication, and learning. In addressing hate speech, I do not suggest that the high threshold to impose limits on free speech should be lowered. The Rabat Plan of Action guidance on addressing incitement to violence and discrimination provides a contextualized 6-part test for assessing whether speech amounts to incitement and therefore should be restricted under international human rights law. It also provides the important insight into the usefulness of counter-narratives to push back against hateful stereotypes and tropes. I have presented 3 reports to the UN on issues linked to hate speech, including one on anti-Semitism and on Islamophobia. These reports discuss good practice in tackling hate speech and provide practical recommendations to states, the media, tech companies, including social media platforms, and educators, amongst others. In my reports, I acknowledge efforts to monitor and facilitate reporting of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidents, including in several EU member states. Some states have created specific task forces or trained police officers to monitor, identify, and respond to hate crimes. The education of the police is also an important part of these efforts. I also recognize efforts to tackle online hate speech, such as engaging with social media companies to develop counter-narratives on hate speech. Some state and civil society organizations conduct public awareness campaigns designed to dispel negative myths and misconceptions. However, much work remains. Undertaking educational initiatives that celebrate diversity and tolerance and engaging the media on their reporting practices are vital for tackling both the root causes of hate speech and means of spreading it. In the case of Islamophobia, I have recommended that the media adopt guidelines for reporting on Muslims and Islam, embedding good practices and avoiding stereotypes and generalizations, portraying diversity, explaining context, and train journalists on other media content produced accordingly. The Observatory of Islamophobia and Media, based in Spain, has undertaken significant work in this regard. Education is crucial and a proactive tool for challenging and changing intolerant attitudes towards these and belief minorities. Educators can develop curricula that raise awareness of human rights and foster empathy more broadly. The UN's Faith for Rights initiative has online resources that uses peer-to-peer learning modules to explore connections between religion, belief, and human rights, thereby emphasizing the role of faith-based actors as potential human rights actors to reduce racism, xenophobia, and intolerance and discrimination more broadly. I've also recommended to all states the use of the IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism as a non-legal educational tool to understand what anti-Semitism is and to combat anti-Semitism in various contexts. I also endorsed the stress made just now by Katharina von Schnaben on the importance of Holocaust education, but also on the important need of not just talking about the Holocaust denial, that is important, but also presenting to everybody the rich contributions made by Jewish communities to our civilization and the continued contribution to the present day as well. Technology is a double-edged sword when it comes to hate speech. On the one hand, where states and tech companies fail to regulate the digital sphere, hate and violent extremism can proliferate with deadly consequences for minorities. On the one hand, digitization facilitates the creation of grassroots networks among faith communities, borderless and cross-communal exchange of information, and vast opportunities for education. Harmful stereotypes and prejudices often have deep historical roots, and some even use selective history teaching as a tool to further intolerance. In my report on anti-Semitism, I note that Jews in some states are subject to narratives meant to humiliate and demean them, along with institutional measures purportedly meant to disavow aspects of their country's Holocaust history. In this report, I suggested that educators adopt what I call effective methodologies for educating students about anti-Semitic narratives, including exploring the history of stereotypes, examining the role of power dynamics in such prejudices, and acknowledging the responsibility for identifying and rejecting anti-Semitic tropes. As the previous speaker noted, learning about these and responding to this is a shared challenge that all of us face. In conclusion, and to quote the preamble of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, the European Union was founded on the indivisible universal values of human dignity, freedom, equality, and solidarity. When there's hostility, discrimination, violence against any minority, we all suffer. Ultimately, we should work with minority communities rather than on affected communities. And this will make our responses to hate speech more effective. I congratulate the organizers of this high-level forum and thank the attendees today as an important platform for conducting constructive discussions, engaging good practice, exchanging good practice, enhancing efforts to tackle challenges posed by discrimination and intolerance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shahid, and thank you for all the very outstanding work you have been doing during the last years on these very important subjects. From all you said, and you said a lot of things, we might come back to them later, I take two quotes. The first one is, hate speech is not limited to marginal groups. I think that's a very important thing we have to bear in mind. It is not a marginal phenomenon. And that hate speech is potentially fatal for minorities, which I think is, again, a very important dimension. And of course, I think we all agree that on the importance of education and of knowledge of history, and also good practices. And you brought in a subject that I'm sure will be taken up by our next speaker, which is the issue of good practices and the formation of police, and namely of police, because we were having a police commissioner afterwards, but also of journalists. But the problem here is always the tension between freedom of speech and hate speech. And how do we get around that? That is a very important area where we always confronted with the abuse of the freedom of speech by the hate speakers. You slightly touched upon another issue which is very important, is the issue of blasphemy. And how do we deal with that when most of our legal frameworks don't contemplate that concept and consecrate full freedom of belief and religious belief. But we can come back to that later if we have the time. I'll now give the floor to our next speaker, Mr. Beau. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for the opportunity to speak about Europol's role in this area. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, at Europol, we closely monitor the developments in the EU member states related to the threat posed by all the forms of terrorism and violent extremism that are covered by our mandate. And we support and we aim to strengthen action by the competent authorities of the member states related to the investigations into politically or ideologically motivated violent extremism and terrorism in all its forms. And as an organization, we at Europol, we recognize and we promote diversity as one of our core values into the agency. And we strive to be an inclusive agency. We do this by reflecting diversity and inclusion in the competency framework of all the people working here, offering trainings on diversity and inclusion, such as understanding unconscious bias, for instance. We organized in 2019 the first Europol Diversity Day, and we have at Europol a dedicated diversity and inclusion steering group. And this steering group, they provide us with a platform for diversity initiatives and awareness raising within the organization. Europol, as itself, we serve as a hub for the exchange of best practices and knowledge as EU level, and I promoted this role in the Europol strategy 2020+. And for this reason, we organize broader discussions on protecting the resilience of police forces against racism and radicalization, and best practices on community policing with all the police chiefs across the European Union. Last December, the German presidency and I invited the police chiefs to a discussion with the Commissioner Johansson on common challenges and issues to protect and to ensure the efficacy and the readiness of police forces in responding to evolving threats, and the role of social media as a vehicle of hate speech, radicalization and terrorism was highlighted during the discussions, and fighting hate speech online was identified by all of us as a key priority. In my discussions with the police chiefs, we agreed on the importance to protect the resilience of our police forces against racism and radicalization, and that proactive and innovative measures and initiatives within national police forces could range from training, which is very important, and mentoring programs to inclusive recruitment processes to foster diversity in the law enforcement community. Europol's European Counterterrorism Center has had a strategic exchange and outreach with EU member states, with the Commission, academia, and other stakeholders on the topic of racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. For instance, through participation in the new program on racially or ethnically motivated terrorism, and through contacts and exchanges with academia and other stakeholders in the margins of our advisory network on terrorism and propaganda. And what we see in the latest EU terrorism situation and trend report is that right-wing terrorism and extremism prominently feature and puts right-wing terrorism in the context of the spread of narratives of hate, which include racism. What we also see is that the operational contributions from member states on right-wing terrorism and extremism continue to increase, but differences between the legal definitions of racism and xenophobia in the different member states lead to different criminal proceedings, and this is influencing both the situational overview and the support that Europol can provide to investigations. At the German's presidency initiative, we coordinated a joint action day against hate speech on the internet in November 2020. 10 member states of the European Union took part in this operation. It was the first of its kind, and law enforcement authorities raided 144 locations and interrogated 96 individuals in relation to offenses such as dissemination of racist and xenophobic hate speech, calls to violence, and incitement to commit offenses. The participating countries, they assessed the Action Day as an important sign of shared opposition to hate and incitement on the internet. and Europol, we can continue to play a key role in sharing and helping to coordinate member states' initiatives in this area. In fact, many member states, they call up Europol to play a strong coordination role in organizing action days at EU level with the aim to target and to dismantle right-wing, violent extremist and terrorist organizations. And this year we aim again at organizing a referral action day on right-wing, violent extremist content online. And a recent operational meeting to prepare this action day revealed strong interest from member states and our operational partners. 19 member states and 9 operational partners confirmed their participation in the next referral action day. It's a very complex topic and it requires strong cross-sectorial commitment. The divergent legal systems present challenges in combating hate on EU level. And having said this, there is agreement on the need to reinforce Europol's EU referral unit to combat online hate speech and extremism in coordination, of course, with the member states. The revision of our legal framework aims at reinforcing the role of Europol in the European Union and the global security architecture. Thank you, and I am available for questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your efforts during these last years in terms of formation and good practices, and to your efforts to promote the efficiency and efficacy of the police in fighting intolerance and racism, and to strengthen at the same time the resilience of these police forces in this fight. I would like to underline 3 things that you said. The first is the difference that still exists between the legal qualifications among the European Union states. Different legal qualification of concepts like racism, denial, xenophobia, intolerance, hate speech. So I think we must carry on along the lines that you have suggested in order to have a much more coherent and an effective definition and legal definition of these concepts, which leads to the other aspect that you underline, which is the need to strengthen the coordination in all these issues among member states. And lastly, the strong cross-sectorial connection of all these issues, and that must be addressed as such. Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time. I don't know our organizers we don't have any time for any questions. Okay. Nevertheless, I think we can write volumes and have many more conferences on issues like, which is for me a very important theme, which is the tension, as I mentioned, between freedom of speech and hate speech and how we deal with it. And the other one is the issue of blasphemy. But we leave that for another conference, perhaps organized by the next presidency of the Portuguese Presidency of the European Union. I'm on my 4th, but I haven't lost hope to be on my 5th too. So thank you all very much, and all the best. Thank you.
Advancing to our second session, we will now have an opportunity to get an insight on the perspectives from research and communities, and to get acquainted with some key findings and facts on the topic of the main trends and challenges for an EU united in diversity. The panel will be moderated by Marta Santos Pais, the Commissioner for the Never Forget Programa Nunca Esquecer, and will rely on the expertise of Michael O'Flaherty, Director of the Fundamental Rights Agency, Teresa Angelino, Deputy Ombudsperson of Portugal, and Sonia Matos, President of the Association for the Development of Portuguese Roma Women. Interventions by the panelists will be followed again by a discussion organized by the moderator, considering your questions posed on the chat.
Well, good morning. A warm welcome to our excellent panelists, and a warm welcome to all those who are following this important conference on protection from racial discrimination and other forms of intolerance. I am very pleased to be joined by three excellent experts, as we have heard. Michael O'Flaherty, Director of the Fundamental Rights Agency. Very briefly, I want to recall that Michael was before member of the Human Rights Committee in the United Nations, played important roles within the UN, including in the research team of UNICEF, where we were colleagues for a number of years. He was Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, chairperson of the Irish Penal Reform Trust, and has a very long career, so I just leave it at that. Michael will be followed by Teresa Angelino. As we heard, she's the Portuguese Deputy Ombudsman in the Provedoria de Justiça of Portugal, the National Independent Human Rights Institution. She has a law degree and a master in human rights and democracy. She was formerly Member of Parliament, Secretary of State in the area of justice, member of the Portuguese Commission for Equality and Against Racial Discrimination. So very happy to have you with us also, Teresa. And we have Sonia Matos, who is President of the Portuguese Association for the Development of Women in the Gypsy Community. Sonia Matos is a mediator, a social-cultural mediator, and a capacity-building leader for the promotion of the Gypsy culture. And she has been a member of the important task force recently set up by the Portuguese government for the prevention and combat against racism and discrimination. Now, as we have heard, our panel is going to address the critical role of data and research to ensure protection from racial discrimination and any other form of intolerance. And I would like to recall very briefly that, as we know, objective, reliable, and accurate data and sound research are very important in any society to help us identify major trends, to capture pressing areas of concern, to enable us to document and replicate promising practices, but very especially to inform policies and actions and interventions that are based on evidence rather than on mere assumptions or pressed by emotional reactions to public pressure. And in addition, of course, data and research help us to expose hidden forms of abuse and human rights violations and strongly challenge the passivity or the indifference in society vis-à-vis these violations, these important violations. So we know that when these important dimensions are lacking in a society, it's much easier to expand misinformation and manipulation. It is, of course, we see a growth in dehumanizing language, stigmatization, in conspiracy myths, as we heard this morning, incitement to violence and hate. And of course, we see a growth in silence, in fear, and mistrust vis-à-vis institutions in the state. And for the victims of racial discrimination and other forms of intolerance, of course, this means feeling deeply scared, hesitating to report any form of abuse, access to justice becomes deeply in danger, and impunity, of course, prevails. And this has happened throughout history, and I think it's never too much to recall that in so many previous moments of our history, this led, lack of data, lack of research, manipulation, and misperception of reality has led to the perpetration of massive and unspeakable atrocities, as it happened during the Second World War and actually during the Holocaust period, as we have heard already this morning a number of times. So, of course, we cannot face these challenges with complacency, and we must act, and I think we are very privileged to have heard already this morning important examples of recent action undertaken within the European Union, the European Summit Against Racism just a month ago, of which this conference is a follow-up, is just one example. But we have seen the adoption of new commitments, new standards, new mechanisms to prevent and to fight against discrimination and racism. And amongst the institutions that are speaking in our conference, of course, we cannot forget others that are not taking the floor, but are with us today and are contributing very heavily to the same goals, like the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of OSCE, that has, for instance, a very important annual report on hate crime that is a very important source for our work. So we have all these important developments, but of course the risks remain very high, and I think we can highlight three major dimensions in today's world. First, we see a growth in anti-Semitic violence, anti-Muslim hatred, prejudice and incitement to violence against minorities, including the Roma minority. Secondly, we see the digital world being used to make it easier and to spread messages of xenophobic and incitement to violence, to spread them quicker and wider across regions. And third, of course, with the current pandemic, we have seen an aggravation of all these situations. So I believe that these different three dimensions are going certainly to frame the discussions in this panel. And I would like to turn now to Michael O'Flaherty, where these risks and concerns have been very high in the studies and reports of the Fundamental Rights Agency. And I'm sure we will hear further about the findings, the concerns, but also the question of how the pandemic is having a very dramatic impact on this reality. Thank you so much, Michael.
Martha, thank you very much indeed. Dear Martha, Presidency, the leadership of the Never Forget program, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. The Fundamental Rights Agency indeed does invest and has for its lifetime invested heavily in the measurement and the assessment of the patterns as we see them of racism across the EU. And it's no surprise to confirm this morning that we see a persisting and sometimes worsening problem, including for the three groups that are the focus of attention today: the Jewish community, migrants, Roma, and travelers. We see across all of the groups worrying levels of discrimination. We see patterns of discrimination, particularly in the workplace, but also in terms of access to housing and social services. Typically, 1 in 3 members of these communities in any given year will experience an act of discrimination. The flip side of discrimination is a pattern of harassment, violence, and attacks. And these are by no means just online. They can, on occasion, be physical attacks against the person. And the incidence of these forms of harassment and violence within the discriminated against groups goes well beyond the experience of attacks in the general population. As Ahmed Shahid emphasized just a few moments ago, we have to take account of the phenomenon of intersectionality, or in other words, the way in which two different attributes of a person intersect to expand the bad experience. I've just come back a few days ago from the European External Frontier speaking with migrants, and I was struck by the story told to me by LGBTI migrants, where the intersectionality of sexual orientation and being a migrant so much compounds the negative experience. We also see it, for example, with regard to women who choose to wear traditional dress, who are targeted for harassment or discrimination, both because of their membership of a minority group and of the way in which, by wearing traditional dress as a woman, the experience gets all the worse. As was mentioned earlier this morning, we know from our evidence persistently across all groups that the experience of young people can actually be worse than that of older people. We surveyed the Jewish community just 2 years ago, and we disaggregated the experience of younger people. We found younger people are more likely to experience an act of harassment. As a result, younger people are more willing to consider emigrating from the European Union. We see a similar experience with other migrant groups in terms of being targeted for attack, and there is a related lack of trust in the authorities of our society. And this lack of trust is a matter of grave concern across the minority communities, because of course it undermines social cohesion, or at least it impacts negatively for social cohesion. This is not the responsibility of the minority groups. It's a society-wide challenge. For example, we know that social cohesion is also profoundly impacted negatively by patterns of discriminatory profiling by security forces, such as, for example, as we know, disproportionately against people of sub-Saharan African origin. Now, 2 points of measurement I'd like to make before passing on. The first is that we have to acknowledge, as I think was noted already this morning, that we only are aware of the tip of the iceberg of patterns of discrimination and harassment against minority groups. There is a dramatic underreporting, typically across groups, be it the Jewish community, be it migrant groups, be it the Roma and travelers. Typically, only 1 in 10 incidents of harassment is ever reported. And so the official figures, to the extent they exist, can only capture a tiny proportion of the actual acts. This is very relevant for policy making. And secondly, and indeed as a function of underreporting and under-publicization of the concerns, we have a worrying level of complacency in our societies about the actual levels of racism. Take, for example, the Jewish community. When we surveyed the Jewish community 2 years ago, something like 90% of the respondents said that anti-Semitism was bad and getting worse. When the European Commission surveyed the general population about anti-Semitism, some 50% said it was a problem. So in other words, the perception of the problem was something like double in the Jewish community that within the general population. Now, turning to COVID, again, I don't have much to add to what's already been said this morning. Everything has been made worse in the COVID experience. Let me illustrate it from the point of view of racism for the particular experience of the Roma community, who have experienced, frankly, a perfect storm of human rights deprivation in the past year. You're asked if you're a Roma to maintain bodily hygiene, wash your hands frequently. There's no running water in the facility where you're housed. You're asked to maintain social distance. You're living in overcrowded accommodation. You're asked to educate your children online. You don't have the internet. You can't afford a computer. You're asked to support your family. You're in precarious employment. You've probably lost the precarious employment. You don't have access to social welfare. And on top of all of this, in so many places, you face horrific claims, hate-filled claims that somehow you are the cause of the virus. So I give this simply as illustrative of the dramatic way in which COVID impacts minority groups and those already subject to patterns of racism. So to conclude, what can we do? So many suggestions have already been made this morning. Let me say that above all else, before we get into any detail of what we must do, we must demand and expect strong political leadership. We must have a cry out against racism by the people who lead our societies. It's only if we have that in a sustained way that will make a difference. And it's in that spirit that I so applaud the initiative of the Portuguese Presidency to give us today's event. But beyond that leadership, some 5 specific considerations that draw from the repeated findings of the Fundamental Rights Agency. First, and it's obvious, but it must be said time and again, racism is not the problem of the group that's impacted. Racism is our problem. It's our society that's racist. It is we must address the racism deep within our own societies. Secondly, as we reflect on how to tackle racism, we have to acknowledge the value of what the European Commission has been emphasizing in the past year, the value of action plans. They're not jargon. They're meaningful vehicles to deliver results. And so it be in the specific context of anti-Semitism or various forms of racism, and more broadly, or the rights of Roma and travelers, we really must have joined up action plans across government, national and local. Third, critical to the delivery of any action, including in the context of action planning, is evidence and data. And would probably come as a surprise to some that we're still not getting that right in parts of Europe. We still have a reluctance, for example, to gather data categorized by ethnicity. There are valid historical concerns about such data gathering, but today, with GDPR and with other protections, those concerns are no longer convincing. We will not fix the problems if we don't gather the evidence. Fourth of my 5 suggestions, go local. We need national action planning, but it has to have within it city and municipality action planning. It's only when we engage at the local level where people live that we will see an eventual turnabout. And then fifth and finally, and I think it was said earlier by Ahmed Shahid and others, but it's so important, let's come out of today's conference not agreeing to work against racism for victims of racism. Let's work with the impacted groups. Let's figure out together how we can make a better future. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michael, for in such an enlightening way recalling such important concerns and making it a very strong appeal, which should never be forgotten, that these problems are our problems, everybody's problems, and not only a few community groups' problems. And it is together that we can identify the roots of these challenges and at the same time put the right action in being implemented to achieve the right results we want. And thank you also for emphasizing again, and you do it so often in the studies of the Fundamental Rights Agency, the question of intersectionality, because very often for study purposes or for data gathering, we look into one part of the picture and we try to forget, or we unintentionally forget the connection with all the others. And above all, I think, thank you also for emphasizing the question of low reporting and how to overcome this complacency in society and lack of trust in institutions, which is such an important dimension of democracy, as we know. I hope we will have time to go back to this. But this leads me very nicely to the second speaker, Teresa Angelino, as we said, Deputy Ombuds here in Portugal. And in this institution, of course, it is very constant, the number of complaints, of requests for help, of victims and others who represent them who come to expose their expectations, to expose hidden concerns, hidden forms of abuse and violations of their rights. And it would be very interesting for us to understand from the point of view of the Provedoria de Justiça how you are capturing these pressing concerns and what are the most important areas where action is needed, especially in Portugal now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, dearest Marta, in the role of moderator, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues of the panel. So good morning. It is, of course, an honor and a pleasure to be here with you and have this opportunity to address in such an important issue. And actually, it comes in a very challenging moment that invites, indeed, reflection, as we also already heard. And as Michelle Bachelet said, if we want to test a prospective vision anchored not only in principles, but of course also in reality, we need to know the past in order to understand the present and of course prepare the future. It's the so-called state of the art. And the truth is, and of course it was already highlighted, the huge lack of data that we have, but we also have very good reports from organizations like FRA, but also more these latest days from states. And the truth is that looking at a recent past, it wouldn't be fair not to recognize how we did a notable path in equality and non-discrimination, adopting solid legal and institutional foundations to combat racism and related intolerances, which brought important advances to our society. However, at the same time, as you also know, it is true that this progress did not benefit everyone at the same time, nor, I would say, at the speed we would wish for. Racial discrimination and other forms of intolerance is a serious human rights issue that continues to impact society. It is, as we heard, our problem. continues to impact society in general, but severely the everyday lives of those it affects, creating marginalization, segregation, exclusion. In an era of rights, we can say that there is still a huge mass of people that continue to live without rights. From direct forms of discrimination, easily to identify, like physical or verbal violence, to more insidious or covert forms, racism and related intolerances are the visible face of an unrealized universal promise of equality. But I think it's important to recall the famous opening words in Rousseau's social contract, overcoming, of course, the gender sensitivity of this phrase and concentrating in the essential. Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. Freedom and equality, as a known philosopher once said, is not a reality but an ideal. It is not an existence but a value, not a being but a must. And why do I say this? Because equality, of course, must be recognized as an in-construction project, never ends. And we need, of course, to recognize this at the same time that we need to recognize, confront, and question the persistent contradiction that exists beyond all our efforts between law in the books and the law in action. That is, we still have a constitutional, legal framework that aims towards a certain normativity where equality is a core value, but this legal normativity coexists with a social normativity where discrimination is not only tolerated, but accepted, and many times consciously or unconsciously reproduced. The system is heavily relying on a top-down social transformation. Nevertheless, we also know that if advances are to be achieved, we also have to acknowledge the incomplete revolution of our times, that is the revolution of mentalities, the social substructs of the norms that resist the bottom-up. This said, it is easy to understand the COVID-19 challenge. Crises are cruel magnifying lenses on prior existence in society inequalities. Knowing this, we cannot allow that the sense of urgency that is behind most of the measures that were taken deviate us from a very important exercise to evaluate the impact of these measures, present, but even more important, future. It is paramount to create awareness in society because by creating awareness, we are capacitating, and by capacitating, we are promoting participation and action, which leads to trust. So the Ombudsman Office is also a national human rights institution, having the particular responsibility to promote and protect human rights, focus mainly on its classical function of complaint handling and the relationship between citizens and public administration. So I could say that it is a privileged observatory of the state and the way it materializes in the lives of citizens that with more or less conscious of their rights appeal to us, putting their problems and seeking solutions. In the last years, we come to pay a growing attention to the nature of the complaints that are being filed in the Ombudsman Office, and so much so to the number, which is invariably low. A small footnote, because jurists do love their footnotes. After almost 4 years of mandate as Deputy Ombudsperson, I think I am allowed to say that it is not indifferent that in our Article 1 of the statute, the word justice comes before the word legality. And I quote, ensuring justice and legality in the exercise of powers. It is true that normally these two concepts are interlinked or considered as one. But if we understand law as it is, comprised of rules that are general and abstract and that are built from a concept of order or what is normal or considered normal, it will not be difficult to understand that not all that is law is fair and not all that is fair is law. And I'm not questioning the goodness of the legislator, but recognizing that imperfection is part of our collective lives, and reality exceeds always the horizon of the legislator. So from a very practical point of view, let's go back to the office. This is a very difficult challenge. that obliges us to look at the complaints or their absence and reflect on the effectiveness of the law, ethical limits of public choices, and also the proportionality and justice of legal guidelines assumed by the individual in favor of society. As you know, most of the times it is the lack of complaints that is considered to be reasonable evidence of the absence of a structural problem. But I think that we must support another interpretation. A complaint is an act of trust from someone that experiences injustice. A complaint is the recognition that certain entities are not only able to hear, but also to understand and to solve. Looking at the state of the art from my point of view, allow me to state the 3 problems or challenges that I'm able to identify briefly. First, we as society have a problem of communication, which cannot be reduced to the idea that we speak the same language. We have to hear, to understand and be understood, even when we are not able to change a given outcome. And in this respect, it is paramount to confront the so-called unconscious bias, detrimental for the necessary change in attitudes, practices, and even public policies. Second, we have a deficit of rights linked to a problem of awareness at all levels, from legal operators, as we heard, to society in general. What we also heard, the lack of knowledge. A good law, a good system, needs to be known and applied. Otherwise, it will only be a scrap of paper or a very beautiful object of art, depending on who is looking. And third, inevitably linked to the other 2, we have a problem of trust in society, in institutions, in political compromises, in state. Language, when it's used in connection with rights, is a powerful instrument, but can also be misleading if it hides the difference between a right that is being campaigned for and a right that is, of course, recognized and protected. If we do not work towards this sense of community, a community where people are heard, understood, and protected, plurality will become fragmentation, and what once was our strength, it will become our weakness. So in sum, even though we still find ourselves from time to time having to justify the existence of certain rights, the question of racism and related intolerance is a problem of protection. So it's not philosophical, it is political and it is legal, and it is in our hands. And for that, we need the bottom-up strategy, and we need trust in institutions and the possibility of progress. And for that, we have to address historical reconciliation, because it's not only the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do, as we also heard this morning. It is also related to knowledge. We have to resist the installed idea of the inertia of history and its monotonous repetition, which many times is responsible for indifference that makes us spectators of our lives instead of agents of change. I'm going to remember Hannah Arendt when looking into the past. The idea that everything that happens in the world must be understandable may take us to interpret history through commonplaces. However, to understand is not to deny in the facts what is shocking, or use generalities that reduce the impact of reality and the shock of experience. It means before and foremost to examine and to conscientiously bear the burden of our past, without denying its existence, but also without bending to its weight. So to understand means to carefully face reality without prejudices and to resist whatever the reality is. The world, in fact, can be different. And I would end by saying that we are not only late, but we also have no time to lose. Thank you very much, Marta.
Thank you very much, Teresa. With your words, I was also thinking about Eleanor Roosevelt, who is always such an inspiration for us, when she was asking, where do human rights start? And if they do not start in our school, our community, our home, then what is the meaning they have? It is there that they need to make a difference. And that's the challenge we have. So we have so many good, important developments, as you have recalled, but we still have this gap between the ideal the movement in slow construction, slow motion, and the urgency of the need to ensure that everyone can enjoy his or her fundamental rights. We will go back to this. In this regard, I would like to recall that there is a chat board, and perhaps we will have time to go back to some of the questions that will be brought to our attention. But now I'm going to turn into Portuguese, and we are going to listen to our third speaker.
It is a great pleasure to now give the floor to our friend Sónia Matos, President of the Association for the Development of Gypsy Women. She's a social mediator. She works daily with men and women, children, to promote her culture and to combat all forms of discrimination. She has done vast work, a lot of work, and we'd like to hear her. Could you tell us what your main concerns are, and how can we deal with these issues, for example, education, among other fields, has shown a number of different activities to be positive for Gypsy communities. Has there been real progress in terms of social inclusion? What good practice can you point to that we might be able to reproduce elsewhere? Thank you once again for being with us. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the Portuguese Presidency of the Council of the European Union, participants, dear guests, and fellow members of the panel. Allow me to begin by thanking you for the invitation to be here today. It's an honor. It is a pleasure to be able to be the voice of the Gypsy community here today. It's very important that this voice be heard and be spoken about. Allow me to give you a brief overview of my association. It's an association that was set up 20 years ago. It is called AMUCIP, which is the Association for the Development of Portuguese Gypsy Women. It was set up by 5 women who back then had recourse to a political measure that revolutionized life for the community. That was the RSI, Minimum Guaranteed Wage. Many didn't expect us to rise to the occasion. The task was a difficult one. I could sit here for a long time telling you about the long road we had to walk down, but thankfully all the thorns are now gone. We have a beautiful rose in front of us. Our association grew. These 5 women undertook training to become mediators, and it was actually one of our trainers that pointed us in the right direction. He said to us, together you'd be stronger, your voice would be louder, and your work would be more visible. And that's exactly what happened. For 10 years, AMUCIP worked hard against all odds. We persisted and prevailed. We used to meet wherever we could find room. It could be a cafe. We improvised and held impromptu meetings. Our offices were the booths of our cars. And so initially, when the 5 women got together, it was a difficult task, but there was a lot of resistance also, it has to be said, from both the Roma community, but also from others around us, non-Gypsies. We didn't feel like we had a safety net. We didn't really know what we were getting into, what we were setting up. On the one hand, we had the Gypsy community, which is patriarchal in terms of its education. Women are not visible, don't really have a voice. And so it was difficult also for the community to have 5 single women and 1 widow speak up. So it was very difficult. we're all talking about this here today because a lot of work still has to be done by institutions, by our government. We need more will to do. In the first few years, we felt that the biggest hurdle was lack of knowledge. People fear the unknown, and so that was a barrier. For 10 years, we decided what we needed to do was train people on our community and our culture, and so we went ahead and did this. We worked with people from education, the social sector, a number of different public institutions, local authorities, social services. The aim was to teach them about our culture, the Gypsy culture, which is a Portuguese culture. That is our culture. We've been in Portugal for over 500 years, 5 centuries. We're part and parcel of the history of this country. We were there on those ships that went out to discover the world, in the discoveries. We took part in war, unfortunately, but we were part of that history. And yet, we're invisible in Portugal as a community. It is the most unknown of all communities in this country to the Portuguese. So the past 10 years allowed us to help do away with stereotypes and lack of knowledge. We were preparing the majority, as it were, for the inclusion of our community. I'm going to try and cut my story short because it's a long history, but 8 years ago, we found a place from which we could work. We got more support from the government, specifically the Office of the High Commissioner. We're still in a place that belongs to immigrants and not to Portuguese, so I'm not sure that's the best place for us, but there has been support given to us in the last few years. There are now 62 women working in Amusip, teaching, reflecting on us, on the I, on the community, identifying problems, presenting proposals to resolve problems, trying to understand how we can organize ourselves. This is our methodology. We empower each other and recognize our potential. The association at the end of the day is a place where we feel we can talk about our real world. We believe we can be heard and understood. So for the past 20 years, Amusip has had to deal with a number of problems, one of which, like I said, lack of knowledge. After that, we started identifying big problems. Housing, for example, which is fundamental for all human beings. All human beings require some sort of housing in order to be able to develop. Housing in Portugal was thought out in terms of social neighborhoods set up in the 90s. It wasn't a positive message. It wasn't a positive measure at all because there is a segregation of the population. We're outside the urban fabric. We're on the periphery. We're invisible to the rest. There's lack of access to the urban environment. And there's also a negative stereotype associated with living in a social neighborhood. Social housing is already seen as negative by the other. That promotes discrimination, which does arise and may lead to racism. Actually, I shouldn't say may. It does lead to racism. This is what happens. When you live in a social neighborhood, you are seen as something negative. And something else I'd like to add is that the Gypsy population has grown over the years, families have grown, we've had children, and those children live mostly with their parents. So sometimes there are 3 family units living in the same house, 4 family units living in the same house. Why? Because these youngsters have no way out. They try and rent a house and are unable to. Measures for all, we're told, but there are always some that are left behind. That's the Gypsies. Our population is not able to rent a home. I can speak to my own experience. Amusip tried to rent a place for its projects. I had to ask my employer, I worked there for 18 years, I'm not there anymore, but I had to ask my employer to help me in order to be able to rent a room for Amusip. Because whenever we explained who we were, the Association for the Development of Portuguese Gypsy Women, immediately the place was taken. It was rented out. It was no longer available to rent. And I'm talking about an association that has been in existence for 20 years and is recognized nationally and at international level, at European level. So imagine if it is that difficult for our association to rent a room, what must it be like for a Gypsy family to try and rent an apartment, a home? This is a fundamental issue when we talk about the development of the Gypsy community. And then there's another situation, forced nomadism. This is a problem we face today. Amusip is also working, for example, in the Alentejo region of Portugal, in Évora, to be specific. I was there last week. Now, in the Alentejo region, there are a number of families who are forced nomads. When I say they are forced nomads, what I mean is that people live somewhere and then the National Republican Guard tells them they have to move on because they don't belong there. And I'm not sure I understand what not belonging there means, because we can live where we would like to live. I think our constitution is very clear when it comes to where we can live. However, these families live like this. This has been the case for 10, 20 years. Some people have faced this kind of forced nomadism for 20 years. They have no place to live. They live in tents. They are, to me, homeless persons. This is reality for these families. Nobody accepts them. Nobody wants them alongside them. They say, well, they're free to rent a place, knowing full well that the Gypsy community is unable to access housing through rentals. So they go from Évora to Moura to Beja and keep moving around in the 21st century. We have people living like refugees in their own country, Portugal. Another difficulty they face, they're not able to acquire an ID card, because if you don't have a fixed residence, you don't exist. You're nothing. Another problem, employability. Employability is extremely difficult to come by for the community. Difficulty in being employed by another. I can tell you that my generation, all those who studied in the last 20 years, are working with the Roma community. That's the field they work in, with the Roma community. We don't see Gypsies working elsewhere. They have to work for their communities. No other doors are thrown open to us. This is the reality we face. This is discrimination. This is racism. We are unable to find jobs. There are many women who come to our training and then go out to look for jobs, and as soon as they identify as Gypsies, they're told, oops, no more vacancy. There was a woman I know who for 2 years worked in a hotel. One of the clients noticed that there was a gypsy working in the establishment, spoke to the person in charge of the hotel, said, you know, it's not a good thing to have a gypsy working for you, cleaning the rooms. What if items disappear? So at the end of the afternoon, the boss said to this employee, who she actually liked very much, look, I can't do anything. I'm sorry, we have to let you go. And this is the reality the gypsy community faces daily. Also, schooling levels are low in our community, but there's also an explanation for this, and we are able to resolve this problem. AMUSIP, for the past 20 years, has been focusing a lot on education because we believe that it is through education that we can achieve greater progress. Only when we empower ourselves through schooling, through education, will we as a community be able to thrive and improve our lives. Low levels of schooling have to do with a lack of representation of our community on school curricula. There's no excuse for this. We have already set up a pedagogical tool validated by the Ministry of Education. The kit is called the Gypsy Soul Kit. It was validated in 2017, as I said, by the Ministry of the Education, and also by 6 schools from the Seychelles area of the country, and all we need now is for it to become part and parcel of the school curriculum. That's my battle that is ongoing this year. The non-existence of mediators in our schools is yet another issue we have to deal with. Studies have already shown, experts have already indicated that mediators are fundamental, social mediators within our schools go a long way to assisting our children in the school environment. They replace the parents, as it were, because most parents are illiterate and cannot help their children. But you might say, well, parents in the gypsy community don't care. That's a lie. I spent 3 years working with the school, and I saw how things changed over time. Gypsy mothers took part whenever I asked them to take part in initiatives organized in the schools. So we have trained mediators in this country, but there are very, very few mediators in our schools. I'd actually say no more than 10 at present throughout the country. And I may be exaggerating a tad. So this is yet another issue that needs to be analyzed and reflected upon. And before concluding, because I'm sure my time is almost up, allow me to make a few suggestions for public policy in housing. And I don't know if this is feasible, but you will know best whether this is possible or not. We need to make it possible for gypsy families to rent homes through a contract with a local authority, for example, so that rental becomes possible for us. Agreements through Social Security, through banking institutions, to facilitate the acquisition of a first home, or rehabilitation. And I like this idea, that rehabilitation of existing buildings that are run down, there are many of those in our cities, so that people feel like they belong to this society. We can only grow when we grow together, not where we're all living in a limited space in a social neighborhood. In terms of employment, representation of our community across government institutions. We have 2 people working in the High Commissioner's office. I'm not aware of any more people representing us at that level, but it is important for the government to set the example so that other institutions may then follow suit. We need support to be given to companies so that companies will hire Roma. But I'm not talking about measures to hire Gypsies specifically. We already have measures which allow for an agreement to be signed with a company. The companies get that support and then some extra support if they hire people who've been long-term unemployed or former drug addicts, people who've been in prison, immigrants, etc. But nobody has put in a provision for Gypsies. So people don't hire Gypsies because nobody wrote, you also have to think about hiring Gypsies. So we need to include the word Gypsy in those agreements. Specific support needs to be given also to the tertiary sector institutions, associations, cooperatives that can help generate jobs as well, NGOs, initiatives at local level for our community need to be long-lasting and sustainable. We've had short-term projects over the last few years, and they've not received adequate funding. When I say they've received very little funding, I really mean very little funding. And in conclusion, finding solutions to these problems means positive discrimination measures. That is how we achieve progress. There is no other way of fighting against this discrimination, this racism. Positive discrimination measures are required. That's how women improved their status. That's how everything happens. That is the only way. We've been doing this for 20 years, and we've been taking baby steps. And there's still a lot of work ahead to guarantee the inclusion of this community, a community that is part of the history of this country. My father only ever showed me the Portuguese flag, only ever taught me the Portuguese anthem. I am Portuguese, first and foremost. I'd like to be proud of my identity. Please don't subtract my identity from me. That is what I ask of all those in the EU. Please look to this type of association. We need your support. Support exists, but those who need it never receive it. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Sonia, por este importante.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for sharing your journey, thus prompting us to reflect on the ever-present challenges in our society, despite the developments you acknowledged, and which we must hope that will be able to replicate and speed up with a view to ensuring social inclusion, combating racism and exclusion, and fostering this notion of belonging. We are sorely lacking in time. I'm afraid we would dearly enjoy having more time to reflect on the important topics discussed, including, for instance, why so few complaints, despite the number of instances that could potentially give rise thereto, or, as FRA studies tell us, how come, even when people are aware that the law is there, and so our institutions, people still disbelieve that anything positive may result therefrom. In any case, one positive thing that comes out of our exchanges is the following coming to us from remote participants addressed to Sonia.
the possibility of ensuring through the presence of school mediators that children are provided support and encouraged to continue, how or what would you believe would be the number one action that we could implement with a view to overcoming challenges by way of stigmatization, exclusion, knowing, as we all do, that education can be so revolutionary in scope and outcome, both in Europe and globally, within a few minutes, of course. It is impossible to boil down into a few minutes what can be achieved. However, based on my own experience, I'm now attending higher education, I'm working towards my social worker degree, and young people around me will not be made aware of the Gypsy community that they will be called upon to work with. So it also has to permeate openness on behalf of the higher education with a view to opening up their curricula to bring it into the classroom, because all of those young people will be leaving shortly and working amongst others with this community of which they know nothing of. I've tried to, whenever there's an occasion, bring something from the Gypsy community. Recently, I took poetry from Dona Olga, a Portuguese Gypsy woman who founded our association, and I was very proud in so doing. I believe that across school levels of education, particularly in primary education, it is crucial to foster belonging in the minds of children. School serves no purpose, according to what our parents tell us, because we are made no space in our society. You'll have to find your own footing when you grow up, and that will mean to start working around 12 or 13. Unfortunately, the Gypsy community has to contend with greater hardship than other communities. What little they had to survive on, namely to sell mainly clothes in fairs and open-air events, no longer is feasible, so they can't do what they used to. When you ask me about change, I believe that change only happens when people are entitled to the rights that all citizens enjoy, and one which is paramount amongst them, housing. I cannot ask people who live in tents to attend school, because those children, if they do it, are already in inhuman conditions because they lack hygiene, which spells out exclusion when they get there, because the other children will want to sit next to them. So it is a problem that does not start in school, but before school. And in order to achieve this integration, there's a path to be made, despite the fact that the government did adopt a policy of which I'm proud, because it was first suggested by a Gypsy association, namely scholarships for young Gypsy higher education learners, through which, when this was the case, we had laughter all round, and people said, well, if we don't even manage to have them attend primary school, how will we get them into college? This started out with 8 people, and we're now 40, and all of those 8 already got their first degree and are now working towards their second. In other words, you can achieve change when you start working, but you have to have pillars on which to build. No microphone, I'm afraid.
I think, unfortunately, we need to leave it here. But of course, the conference will be pursued, and we will follow now with the third panel. And we hope we will all continue to reflect together about all these questions, no? No?
Our final session will be on policies and programs on protection from Goal will be to get acquainted with policy and programming framework, as well as to gain inspiration from good practices on protection from discrimination. The moderating responsibilities will lie with the World Jewish Congress representative, Mr. Leon Saltiel, and the panel will include Ambassador Georges Santerre, former president of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Inês Ferreira Leite, member of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance from the Council of Europe, and Sonia Pereira, High Commissioner for Migration and President of the Commission for Equality and Against Racial Discrimination. And at the end, don't forget, you can use the chat. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I would like to welcome you to the third and last but not least panel of the Conference on the Protection from Racial Discrimination and Related Intolerance, organized in partnership with the Programa Nunca Esquecer in the framework of the Portuguese Presidency of the Council of the European Union. My name is Leon Saltiel, and I'm the representative at the United Nations in Geneva and UNESCO, and coordinator on countering anti-Semitism for the World Jewish Congress, an organization representing Jewish communities in 100 countries. And it's a great honor and a pleasure to moderate this session today. In the previous sessions, we discussed the need to counter hate speech, the role of human rights education, history teaching and the media, as well as issues of integration, diversity, and discrimination. In this session, we'll focus on policies and good practices on the protection from discrimination and discuss the policy and programming framework, as well as gain inspiration from good practices on protection from discrimination. From my part, I'd like to briefly refer to 3 good practices from the perspective of the World Jewish Congress. The first is a website we have developed together with UNESCO, aboutholocaust.org, with a goal to provide historically accurate data so as to help counter Holocaust denial and misinformation, in particularly online. Recently, this website has been integrated with Facebook, so users who search for queries about the Holocaust will be directed to this site. In addition, we encourage all states to adopt and implement the ARA working definition of anti-Semitism as a very practical way to define this phenomenon and train law enforcement, prosecutors, and other civil servants in order to effectively fight it. Lastly, we call on all states to appoint special envoys on combating anti-Semitism so as to better coordinate policies and promote the exchange of good practices on the international level. With this brief introduction, I'm honored to give the floor to the distinguished members of this panel. I would like to first invite Professor Inês Ferreira Leite, member of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance of the Council of Europe, to take the floor. Is Ms. Leite available? Could the moderator maybe allow her to speak, please? Maybe I give the floor to Ambassador Georges Santerre until they can give her speaking privileges. Ambassador Santerre of Luxembourg, former president of IRA. Apologies for these technical problems. I'm sure the organizers are trying to deal them very swiftly. And we'll get back to the discussion shortly. Thank you for your patience. Professor Ferreira Leite, I see you. Can you turn on your camera and the microphone?
Yes, good morning. Everything is fine.
Please go ahead. Sorry
Yes.
for the technical problems.
It's okay. So very good morning to all of you, everyone listening as well. I will then, I think there's two of me, but I think that's okay. I will then start my conference. So I'm a member of European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, ECRI. ECRI is currently working on an update of the General Policy Recommendation number 5 on combating intolerance and discrimination against Muslims, and also working on a General Policy Recommendation 9 on preventing and combating anti-Semitism. I'm working as the Vice President of the work group on the revision of the General Policy Recommendation number 5, combating intolerance and discrimination against Muslims. And we are working, of course, closely with the other work group that is tackling recommendation number 9 on anti-Semitism. My knowledge is a little more oriented towards the anti-Muslim hate, because that's what I've been working for the last year. But of course, a lot of the proposals and policies concern all forms of discrimination, and also we are working closely together so that there's no contradictions or substantial differences in policy when it comes to the two work groups. So my intervention is divided in 3 parts. Firstly, a reference to the more consensual and main policies. Secondly, a reference to some intersectionality issues. And lastly, a brief reflection on the more problematic or contentious proposals. So starting with the main, more consensual policies, there's maybe 3 lines of action that are fundamental when it comes to these updates for the 21st century of the recommendations, the policy recommendations, and they are education, training, and online acting. So actions. So when it comes to education, it's fundamental to invest in that area, making sure that, and I think that our Ministry of Justice, our current Ministry of Justice in Portugal, she said a few years ago that all through the last half of the 20th century, the 20th century, there was this conviction, maybe a little bit optimistical, that if we were to educate the vast majority of the society, just educate them, making sure they stay in school, that they had a better view and understanding of the world, and more knowledge, then of course then racism would disappear, because educated people understand that racism has absolutely no grounds, no fundamentation, there's absolutely no justification for racism, and of course that proved to be wrong. That's true. We are here now, more than 20 years of on the 21st century, 2 decades of the 21st century, and we are still dealing with racism, discrimination, hate speech, and it's still a problem. It's still a major problem in our societies and a major source of violence. So merely education didn't work, but what may work, and we should try for sure, and a lot of studies and research tell us that it may work, is including in education specific tools to sensitize the children since a very young age to the devastating effects of racism and the discrimination. And there's a beautiful experience made in the 70s in the United States. It's called Blue Eyes, Green Eyes. blue eyes, brown eyes, I'm sorry, and with children of the first grade of school, that perfectly exemplifies the impact of understanding racism and discrimination. And so one of the most important policies that it's been defended is promoting learning about the Jewish history and the positive contributions of Jewish person, communities and culture to European societies. Also, the same thing, promote learning about the positive contribution of Muslim persons and culture in our communities to European societies, and making children understand with the proper account of history that the European culture was built upon a multiplicity of cultures and influences, and a lot of our positive traditions, habits, expressions from that acquis of a multiplicity of cultures. And that's something that we all should be proud of and grateful for. There is not one identity of being European. There's not one identity, there's not one race, there's not one type of being European. And so that's important. Also, plan relevant and effective educational activities, including these education efforts in the programs of schools to better understand anti-Semitism, Muslim hate, to prevent these realities, and to how to respond, how to react, how to tackle when they're confronted with such events. Ensure that education efforts to prevent and combat discrimination include as main learning outcomes capacity for critical thinking, resilience against anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate and all forms of racism and discrimination, an ability to contextualize anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate and to challenge these prejudices and stereotypes, and of course, training for empathy for victims of anti-Semitism and Muslim hate, of course, and all forms of racism. That these are specific tools and goals that we should have in the programs and through games, through role-playing experiences and activities that should really confer to these children as they grow up the tools to not only be more aware and empathetic, but also to defend themselves, to protect themselves, because a lot of these children are, for one reason or another, also victims of racism and discrimination. Another of the main actions is, of course, training of police forces, training of public officers to make sure that they are aware of these stereotypicals and prejudice, and that they can, within their exercises and working habits, not perpetuate these same ideas. Of course, now training of the police forces is a main issue because of the racist discussion against Black people, but it's also a wider concern. Then we have the media, and of course, online hate speech has become one of the major problems that, of course, ECRI wants to really study and propose some more effective policies, because online hate speech is very much connected to the supposed the conspiracy theories and post-truth movements, alternative fact movements, fake news movements. It's of all the conspiracy theorists and fake news propagators that we have been studying and that we see, and I follow them in Portugal. I have tried to, sort of understand what they're saying a little bit, so I'm aware. And all of them make some connection other to Jewish organizations, or is the State of Israel, or they make connections to Muslim organization, Muslim states, China sometimes. Now with the virus, China is also being called upon, the conspiracy theorists. In fact, conspiracy theories and fake news, they walk hand in hand with hate speech and the propagation of discrimination, stereotypical ideas, and prejudice. So this is a serious threat to democracy and to the development progress of most societies. So this has to be a central issue. And when it comes to that, ECRI proposes that there should be encouragement and some sort of programs of sensibilization and awareness to encourage political actors, opinion leaders, and other public personalities to take a firm public stand against anti-Semitism or anti-Muslim hate, speaking out against its various manifestations, and of course, what we are seeing also growing in some European countries is the public hate speech of political actors, opinion leaders, and other public personalities themselves take the role of propagating hate speech. Of course, this is a very diplomatic way of saying that countries should be concerned about respecting political freedom and free speech, about trying to raise awareness to the public speakers of these situations. Also very important is the recommendation for each country or collectively to conclude agreements with social media companies, telecom operators, and internet service providers in order to establish effective systems to monitor and stop hate speech online. This is, of course, extremely important. Not only we must restrain the dissemination of hate speech, but also we have to make sure that any detrimental video, text, whatever that is in the internet can be removed quickly and with very objective, uniform grounds, so that we don't have these every social media or internet company has its own criteria, and there's no agreement, and then perfectly innocent publications are removed, and people feel that their freedom, their internet freedom, is being attacked, unjustifiably attacked. But then if we have global, objective, very transparent criteria to understand when is it that we should intervene and restrain free speech in the internet to make a balance between these conflictual values, and then it is justified or reasonable to exclude some materials from some sites. So also in a more secondary role, then we want to make sure that there is a collection of data on racist, anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim hate incidents and crimes, so that it can be studied. Now, we don't have in all the European countries, for instance, in Portugal, we do not have a centralized data collection on these events. There's several institutions with some data, but there is not a centralized database of exactly how many hate crime incidents or violence with racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim motivations happens, and so that there's a possibility of academic and statistical analysis of these data, so that we can understand it better and have a better prevention and more effective policies. And then let me see any more. Of course, support the activities of non-governmental organizations that are combating these anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate. Also very important, the inter-dialogue between different organizations with different scopes of action. For instance, anti-racist against Black people organizations, different ethnic and religious communities, to promote intercultural and interreligious dialogue and tolerance through sustained efforts and broad outreach involving a wide range of societal actors, having diverse events, and also promoting this idea that, of course, our racialization, there's not really a concept of race, but the racialization, our ethnicity, our identity, our religion, they are just secondary aspects of what is the most important, that we are all human, we are all part of some community, and that in a way we all want what's best for our communities and for our societies and the progress for our world. Also encourage and support research projects and independent monitoring of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and racism. This is connected, of course, with the collection of data. And I think that, oh yes, important, make sure that religious requirements are reasonably accommodated by any public institution, so that there's not, that the people are not put in the difficult position where they have to choose between having a public job or in a public school and giving up, forfeiting their religious identity or religious requirements in some way. Also connected with this, ensure that all local, national, international sport bodies promote action against racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Muslim hate at sporting events and in their publications. A lot, for instance, in Portugal, a lot of our racist, collective racist events have been connected with sporting events. And so, of course, we need to make sure that that's also a priority. And of course, make sure that victims of hate speech, discrimination, racist acts, and so on are given proper guidance, support, and make sure that they have the support during the proceedings, and of course to make sure that they receive adequate compensation, well, according to their needs. Now, this is general policies. Now I will go to the intersectional policies that we are studying. Of course, all of these policies, I mean, some of them are perfectly consolidated on ECRI's history, country monitoring, and previous general recommendations. Others are just proposals that we are studying. None of these that I'm talking about are yet officially approved by the plenary of the ECRI. That's also why I'm talking about them in a way as proposals, as ideas, as contributions, because we will still have a broad discussion on all of these issues, and a lot of these issues, the ones that I'm talking about from this moment on, are contentious, and we are, of course, not in agreement. But when it comes to intersectionality, there's a few issues that should be tackled. Also, it's particularly, I think that when it comes to anti-Muslim hate, that there are specific issues here. Of course, you can say that there's also anti-Semitism connected with Orthodox Jews, the Yazidi. There could be also an issue there. That could be very parallel to some issues concerning anti-Muslim hate. And of course, I will bring the issue of the difference between hate speech and reasonable criticism, which of course there has to be a space for reasonable criticism, but I think we should promote the positive contributions that these communities are giving to understanding intersectionality and to preventing any kind of gender violence and so on. And so there is one day's International Purple Hijab Hijab Day that is promoted by Muslim communities. It is a day about specific to prevention of domestic violence, and it should be celebrated. It should be given more visibility. It's a positive contribution from the Muslim community against domestic violence, and this is, of course, to balance the stereotypical vision that there is a more prevalent domestic violence within the Muslim community. Also, there should be specific policies addressing the fact that Black Muslims are even more vulnerable among Muslim communities, as they are more likely to be exposed to intersectional forms of discrimination, racism, and prejudice, because they have multiple sources. There are also, of course, the Black man is a serious problem within both Muslim communities and Black communities, because they are both being stereotyped as violent, as potentially violent, as sources of danger. For different reasons. When it comes to Muslim men, they are specifically being portrayed as a source of danger concerning terrorism. And of course, when it comes to Black men, is violence or common criminality, drug trafficking, and so on. And so if you are a Black Muslim, then your vulnerability to all these forms of discrimination and prejudice is extremely high. So special attention should be given to these to Black Muslims. Also, extremely important is to generate a stronger sensitivity towards Muslim LGBT plus people or persons who are exposed to these intersectional forms of racist, homophobic, transphobic, and sexist behavior. These people, they also have a multiple of discrimination sources, because they can be discrimination by non-Muslim communities, as any LGBT plus person may be, but they're also being discriminated within the Muslim community. And so there is a double jeopardy on these people that must be taken into account. For instance, one possible prevention tool is to include in the training and education that is given to refugees and asylum seekers that come from Muslim communities and are Muslim, or have or take strongly part in the Muslim culture, even though their religion might not be at all or Muslim, that they are given training on prevention of LGBT discrimination. That is one of the policies that we are considering as recommendation for the countries. And then we go to the more problematic as the end of my intervention. And one of the most problematic has been how to distinguish between hate speech and reasonable criticism when it comes to the criticism of the State of Israel. It is now understood that the attack of the Jewish people's right to an identity state as Israel is generally to be perceived as potentially at least hate speech. And there are several policies that are connected to these. But for instance, I will name one that I think it should be the least contentious, is that to ensure the condemnation of activities that promote boycotts of the State of Israel, Israeli nationals, or Israeli companies and institutions in a racist manner. And I say that it's the least contentious because it includes in a racist manner. And so, of course, there is a space to admit that there could be any sort of boycott that is not racist. I mean, theoretically, it's possible to admit that, even though the nature of the boycott itself is a very radical measure that doesn't allow for shades of different views or perspectives on an issue. But I will follow here the lessons of Professor Tariq Moudoud. He's a professor of sociology, politics, and Public Policy in the University of Bristol Research Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. And he gives us 5 criteria that I think are absolutely perfect to distinguish between hate speech and reasonable criticism. And of course, he uses this criteria for anti-Muslim hate, but they are universal. They can be used to any sort of hate speech or source of racist speech or discriminatory speech. So the first question is, does the criticism stereotype the protected group by assuming that they all think the same? So the question is, does the criticism seems to suggest that all Jewish, all Black people, or Muslims have they have this blameworthy characteristic that it's a feature that defines this protected group, that is inevitable, and of course this becomes the most salient or important characteristic and draws out any other worthy characteristics and ignores contextual factors. So if the answer is yes to this question, then we are entering the realm of hate speech or discriminatory speech and not reasonable criticism. The second question is this about Muslims or Jewish? Are we defining on an external perspective, or are we entering in a dialogue with these protected communities, dialogue with Jewish people, with the Israelis, with the Muslims, with the Black people? And that is this a dialogue of reasonable criticism that they should wish to join in? They may choose not to, but that in theory that they should wish to join in. I mean, does the mode of criticism consists of absolute generalization about a group in a way tends to exclude them, or is this a conversational, or treats the protected group as conversational partners who share common concerns and that should dialogue about an issue? So of course, if the answer to this question is an generalization that excludes the protected group, then we are in the realm of hate speech. If this is about a conversation, a dialogue, then we are within reasonable criticism. And then the third criteria is that this question: is mutual learning possible? I mean, is the person doing the criticism also available to understand the other perspective and to recognize some merits on the other perspective? For instance, the example that Professor Taruk gives is that if you're criticizing, for instance, the Muslim culture for sexual conservatism or Puritanism, are you willing to listen to those Muslims who think that contemporary societies are over-sexualized and encourage sexually predatory and undefined behavior? Because there could be merits in both perspectives. There could be, and I'm sure there is merit in both perspectives. So is your form of criticism still giving space to recognize some sort of merit on the other, on some people from the protected group's perspective? If you have that space, then of course you are perfectly within reasonable criticism. But if you
Professor Ferreira, if I could,
yes,
the time is running out. If you could kindly wrap up.
Okay.
Go to the other speakers. Sorry for that. Apologies.
Okay, no, that's okay. I thought I maybe a little shorten this. So I'm just going to finish these distinctions, and that's it. And then if there are questions, then I will leave the rest for the questions. So of course, if you don't have that space, then you are within hate speech. And then, of course, the question is the language civil and contextually appropriate. Of course, if you use extremely derogatory terms, then you cannot say that you are within reasonable criticism. Then you are clearly within hate speech. And then finally, the last question is this criticism insincere for ulterior motives? or which means is this person doing the criticism really not concerned about the issue, not even empathetic toward that issue, but just using that issue to attack Muslims or Jewish people or Black people or homosexuals or or women or whatever. So is there a sincere care about the main issue and the discussion around it, or is just a pretext for pure hate speech? So those are the main criteria, and those criteria can be used to understand and to moderate all the policies concerning what is the definition of hate speech, what is the difference between crime and just free speech, and they're very nice orientations. And then I will leave the rest for questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Ferreira Leite, for this very rich presentation where you discussed inter alia the importance of education. You spoke about how to fight online hate, a lot about intersectionality, and of course, the last part about hate speech, personal reasonable or criticism. As we are running a bit out of time, without any further ado, I would like to welcome and give the floor to Ambassador Georges Santerre of Luxembourg, former president of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, to take the floor. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saltiel. Leon, we are very, very happy to be moderated by a knowledgeable man, knows IRA, knows many and various perspectives of the topics that are today at stake. My thanks go also to the EU presidency of Portugal for holding this high-level conference. And I'm particularly honored to represent IRA in this gathering, because it was during the Luxembourg presidency in December 2019 that we accepted Portugal as the youngest member. This was a great event of our presidency because, the links, popular links between our two nations are very big. We have 18% of population of Portuguese origin. And we dedicated also some big exhibitions to Portugal, notably to Aristide Sousa Mendes. I think it has been the biggest exhibition that has ever been devoted to this savor of many thousands of Jewish lives, that has also given visas to the royal family in Luxembourg and to members of the Luxembourg government. A last thought of introduction is today with our Greek friends. I transmit greetings from Greece that has taken over the presidency of IRA this month. I think that, well, unfortunately, I cannot take it for granted that IRA is a well-known animal in town. We have emerged from a series of conferences on anti-Semitism in the late 80s when this phenomenon had reappeared, and it was due to the courage and determination of the Swedish Prime Minister, Per Persson, with the support of leaders like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, that discussions were held in Stockholm. At one of these meetings in 2000, there was a spontaneous move to put some ideas that were discussed on paper, and this has become the Stockholm Declaration, which is in fact the birth certificate of the organization. It's extremely beautiful reading. I recommend it to you. And it's one of the papers everybody has to accept, to adhere to when he wants to join IRA, as is now since last year, the ministerial declaration, to which I will revert briefly. Until 2013, we were called the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Remembrance, Education and Research. Then the name changed into an intergovernmental organization with the name of International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. But let me point out that already in 2009, we took the wise decision to add also the fight against anti-Gypsyism into the mandate prerogatives of the IRA. Today, we are 34 member states, 7 observers, so people and nations that should eventually, if they are ready to take over all the acquis, become members, full-fledged members, and we have 8 permanent international partners organizations. So that I would like to make a small point. Among these organizations, we have the UN, the EU, the OSCE, Council of Europe, Fundamental Rights Agency, and quite some others. This is for us very important because through different membership, we reach out to members that are not in our club. For instance, in the Northern African part or Eastern Europe or the Near East, and this is extremely important. Having mentioned the international partners, I would like here to insist once more how important it is to federate our efforts in order to fight with our united determination against the scourge of anti-Semitism, anti-Gypsyism, and all other grave forms of discrimination. Let us commonly and openly admit that the Hydra has risen globally, it said again. And this fight should not only be an endeavor for governments, but must be a sacred cause for all our societies and for all our citizens. They need to take into their hands what the Germans called Zivilcourage, civic courage, to help overcome this plight. The uniqueness of the IRA is the intense and dynamic cooperation between the academic world of experts, quite many, the leading experts in the world in their fields of action, and the political diplomatic level. The week-long plenary sessions bring these two groups together in stimulating exchanges that are giving birth to courageous and innovative initiatives. Certainly, the Alliance would deserve a more widespread reputation because of its thematic efficiency, the seriousness of the expertise, and the pragmatic approach to solve problems. Well, as you know, Leon, we have become more known after the 2016 adoption of a non-legally binding working definition on anti-Semitism. And I'm very happy that some of my previous speakers have mentioned that and have mentioned this favorably. I would, in this context, like to pay tribute also to my German successor, Ambassador Küchler, because Germany, with utmost determination and energy, has managed in this, and at a very timely period, but also the EU was discussing on a Roma action framework. So Germany and the 34 countries came up last year with a working definition, equally non-legally binding, on anti-Gypsyism. These documents are extremely precious tools to guide governments, societies, associations, the academic world in its fight against the offensive of well-known old forms of discrimination that are spreading today even faster given modern ways of communication. I am fully aware that some of the examples, and my predecessor, Mrs. Ferreira, later mentioned also one country where sometimes there are these disturbances in the mentioning of examples. But I'm quite sure that the examples coming along with the working definition on anti-Semitism have given rise, yes, here and there, to contestation and sometimes heavy opposition. My task today is not to refute these attacks. However, I would like to firmly stress here that if we want any definition to be used in the training of police, educators, the judiciary, then there is a need to give them at hand illustrative examples in order to enable them to fill their task of fighting offensively the various forms of serious discrimination. That, again, firmly part of the attitude of too large a part of our societies. I'm sure that quite a number of misunderstandings between defenders of and opponents to some of the examples could be eliminated if the critics were ready to sit down and engage in a trustful and analytical exchange on the real substance behind the instances that have given rise to criticism. We need national strategies, and that was already accentuated several times, to fight against anti-Semitism, anti-Gypsyism, and other forms of discrimination. In some countries, we might even need a strengthening of some paragraphs in the penal codes. This is the moment for me to compliment the EU Commission for the excellent work done since a couple of years, and I include in this compliments the highly valued statistical and analytical work done by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, FRA. The agency offers most of the data on which our assessments are based, and on that basis, the Commission and the member states of the EU, but also IRA, can elaborate the tools we all need to go against the shameful reappearance that the world, after the cataclysm of some 80 years ago, should never have been allowed to see again. Before I close this intervention on my side, I would like to mention some successes that were collectively, I stress collectively, and in a spirit of great solidarity, achieved during the Luxembourg presidency from March 19 to March 2020. This is only to give you some examples of what IRA can concretely contribute to our collective endeavors. And here I would like to mention, above all, the elaboration by some of the best experts in Holocaust education of a compendium called Recommendations for Teaching and Learning About the Holocaust. The text can be easily found on the website of IRA. I'm sure that we all are convinced that a long-lasting and sustainable success in eradicating the vicious phenomena we are witnessing today can only be achieved through education of the younger generations. Serious progress was made over recent years in the preservation of some memorial sites or granting expertise in the programmatic arrangements for musea. I was especially proud to witness under the Luxembourg presidency the adoption of a law by the Serbian parliament, making sure that the Nazi concentration camps in Belgrade will be preserved, restored, and become a place where we are confronted with the painful European past, but also should get some instructive lessons to guard against the dangers of the present. The survivors, these invaluable witnesses and warning voices from the past, will soon not be among us anymore. The ongoing pandemic has even accelerated this unavoidable process of life. Sites, and this is my firm conviction, will therefore be even more of the utmost importance when the last voices from the camps will have become mute. They are the new main witnesses of an inglorious past. In the year 2020, a year of many solemn commemorations, I'm so proud that in the context of IRA, the community of member states managed to craft a strong declaration that was adopted on the ministerial level on the 19th of January last year. From this year of commemorations and solemn speeches, there is this document of legacy, this legacy of 14 substantial paragraphs with sometimes courageous and non-customary language, indeed a call for concrete political actions approved by the political representative of 34 sovereign states. And Leon, as we sometimes and frequently, the fate of the Roma community was mentioned. Let me just quote very briefly paragraph 4 so that you can see what really was the courage with which we drafted collectively these 14 paragraphs. Paragraph 4, we remember the genocide of the Roma. We acknowledge with concern that the neglect of this genocide has contributed to the prejudice and discrimination that many Roma communities still experience today. This must have been said, and I think it was at these commemorations the right place to be said. I'm absolutely confident that this political binding document can be the point of departure for new assessments of the past of our countries, for a more dynamic cooperation between states, expert NGOs, not only within IRA, and I recall that most of the EU member states are members of IRA, it can provide a real boost in research. By the way, I believe that historic research is not only an honest look into what some consider to be almost a closed past, but that the results of this research work will help us to see the warning lights in societies around the globe when they accept in their midst features of intolerance and discrimination that, if we let them expand, can bring back the evil spirits of a dreadful past. And to those who might consider that many of our common evaluations are both exaggerated and too much tainted in black and bleak colors, we should hand out a map with all the genocides that have occurred after World War II, including to our great shame in the midst of Europe. And while we are gathering here, genocidal practices are looming or are even orchestrated, notably in some parts of Asia. And this on the basis of ethnic and religious discrimination. Unfortunately, features that could be qualified as du déjà vu. With this, I would like to thank you very much for having given me the floor and allowed me to speak on behalf of the member states of the IRA community. Thank you so much, Leah.
Ambassador Santer, thank you as always for speaking about the important work of IRA. I had the honor myself to attend 2 sessions in Luxembourg under your presidency, where I could see the fruitful outcome of all your hard work. And of course, it's important to highlight your leadership in the milestone 2020 ministerial position of IRA and encourage all participants of this call to read this very important document. With that, I would like to move to Dr. Sonia Pereira, Portugal's High Commissioner for Migration and President of the Commission for Equality and Against Racial Discrimination, to take the floor. Please, Madame Pereira.
Thank you, dear Chair, and thank you as well for the opportunity of sharing with you some of our experience in the important matter that is being addressed here today. To start off with an important idea of the background of the context we are still facing at European level. According to the EU Agents for Fundamental Rights, 45% of people of North African descent, 41% of Roma, and 39% of people of Sub-Saharan African descent have been faced with discrimination. 11% of Jews had also felt discriminated against because being Jewish. Discrimination on the grounds of racial or ethnic origin is prohibited in the EU. The EU has indeed a legal framework in place, including the Racial Equality Directive and the Framework Decision on Combating Racism and Xenophobia. And in September 2020, the European Commission launched the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan 2020-2025. Yet such discrimination persists in our societies, and over half of Europeans believe that discrimination is widespread in their country. In Portugal, discrimination on the grounds of racial or ethnic origin is prohibited by the law number 93 of 2017 that establishes the legal regime for the prevention, prohibition, and punishment of discrimination on the grounds of racial and ethnic origin, color, nationality, ancestry, and territory of origin. The High Commission for Migration, ACM, through the Commission for Equality and Against Racial Discrimination, the so-called KICDR, has the mission to prevent and prohibit discrimination on the grounds of racial or ethnic origin, ascendancy, color, nationality, and territory of origin. The Commission is a specialized body in the fight against racial discrimination. It is composed by 31 members, including government representatives covering different areas, as well as civil society organizations. These include migrant, anti-racist, and human rights organizations, as well as members of parliament. I would like to share with you some of the good practices that have been implemented in our country in this domain. Firstly, equality data. Portugal has developed several efforts to systematically record, collect, and publish equality data annually, to develop effective evidence-based legal and policy responses to this phenomenon. We highlight, for example, the annual report, which compiles in a single document the available data on equality and racial and ethnic discrimination provided by all the entities that are entitled to work with the current subject, highlighting the trends in this subject at national level. Secondly, awareness campaigns. The Commission actively participates in the National Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination on the 21st of March, which is also the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In 2020, to mark the day and due to the restrictions imposed by COVID-19, the Commission launched a campaign on Facebook that consisted of billboard advertising with the hashtags for equality, for diversity, for respect, intended to raise awareness on the spread of hate speech on social media and encouraging the reporting of offensive content. Also on September 1st, a new online campaign was launched to mark the 3rd anniversary of the entry into force of the legal regime for the prevention and fight against racial discrimination. And this was celebrated with the dissemination of information cards that intended to make known the competencies of this commission, the scope of non-discrimination law, and also the mechanisms available to report discrimination and how to file a complaint. These cards that were used in this campaign have also been further disseminated, for example, to all schools in the country as a resource to also work on the education that we have heard here before that is fundamental to fight discrimination. Thirdly, training and awareness raising. As an important good practice, we would like to point out our great commitment towards the reinforcement of awareness raising in matters of anti-discrimination among professionals of all sectors. This way, since the year 2018, there have been several awareness raising sessions, especially for security forces. In 2019, the Commission provided a total of 23 sessions, which reached 689 participants. These training and awareness sessions include security forces, immigrant associations, Roma associations, also specific projects in the area of education, schools, and members of civil society. In 2020, and despite the pandemic restrictions, the Commission provided a total of 12 sessions, which reached 168 participants. And in collaboration with the Choices program that targets child and youth at risk and develops a series of activities, including mediation with schools and families, aiming to provide social inclusion of children and young people, aiming to guarantee equal opportunities and strengthening social cohesion, the Commission was responsible for 2 awareness-raising sessions regarding the prevention and combat of discrimination, which involved 47 participants and was very much focused on youth and children. The High Commission for Migration also celebrated different agreements with public entities to develop further these training and awareness raising sessions regarding the prevention and combat of racism and discrimination. These sessions include topics such as literacy on racism and racial discrimination, the national non-discriminatory law, immigration policies, and intercultural learning. And in this respect, different areas of the High Commission for Migration have been involved, including one that is specifically dedicated to Roma communities and to provide awareness raising and also an understanding of Roma history and culture and the history that relates to their being part of Portuguese society. We highlight the agreement Together for All, celebrated between the High Commission for Migration and the Public Security Force, which aims to give a deep insight on the legal mechanisms and the legal framework in what respects the migrant situation in Portugal. It has been in force since July 2016 and has been recently redesigned to better adjust to the realities that we are facing today. Also in force is a similar agreement between the High Commission for Migration and another security force, the Republic National Guard, which has been in force since 2017. And also this agreement has been recently redesigned to adjust to the realities that we are facing today and involves, for example, very recently, an initiative that is intended to provide tools to the National Guard to be able to develop actions on discrimination in schools for the children as part of their work inside the school system. We highlight another agreement celebrated between the High Commission for Migration and the Directorate General for Reinsertion and Prison Services. This has been in force since July 2018 and has reached nearly 600 employees of the Directorate General for Reinsertion and Prison Services. Lastly, in July 2019, ACM signed an agreement with the Directorate General for the Qualification of Workers in Public Functions, and this is intended to define and create specific prevention and combat discrimination contents that should be included in actions that are designed to train civil servants. Finally, I would like to briefly mention media and hate speech. We also have issued a recommendation to the adherence to the principle of non-reference to racial and ethnic origin, color, nationality, ascendancy, and territory of origin, and the documental situation of the Commission. This is intended to eradicate stereotypes, hate speech, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other demonstrations of intolerance in public communications. This recommendation has also been supported and conveyed by the regulatory entity for social communication itself, urging the media to adopt the recommendation approved by the Commission. And this, we believe, is an important step towards fighting discrimination in communication. A final word is related to the challenges that have been brought by COVID-19. And just to highlight that during the state of emergency that the pandemic has caused, the Commission kept all services operational. And this included one important part of the Commission's work, which is related to the reception of complaints, their technical analysis and processing. Indeed, in 2020, the Commission for Equality and Against Racial Discrimination has received a total of 655 complaints, which represents a growth of more than 50% from the 346 complaints received in 2019. There are different reasons that may explain this growth, namely the better use of online mechanisms, the greater awareness of the Commission and of the mechanisms that are in place to voice situations of discrimination, and does not necessarily imply that there has been a rise in discrimination. It does indeed reflect also the presence of online digital tools, social media, and also what it has represented in terms of making discrimination acts more present in social media and other online forums. The Commission has reinforced its online presence and disseminated the information regarding the possibility of filing a complaint through an electronic form or by email. And notwithstanding the suspension of administrative and judicial deadlines imposed by the state of emergency, the Commission maintained the provision of information to victims of racial discrimination in order to defend their rights, and proceeded with the forwarding of complaints to the competent authorities in applicable cases. And this relates to the fact that the Commission only has mandate over certain kinds of sectors where discrimination is felt. And when it relates to other areas, the Commission forwards the complaint through a referral mechanism to the competent entities. Regarding new policies and actions that are also being developed, in January 2021, the Portuguese government created a working group for the prevention and combat of racism and discrimination. And this has worked as a think tank for the creation of the National Plan to Combat Racism and Discrimination. This working group has a multidisciplinary composition, and it included specialists and representatives of anti-racist associations, as well as other representatives of civil society. The National Plan to Combat Racism and Discrimination is currently on public consultation, as has been mentioned here before. The National Plan follows the call of the European Union Action Plan Against Racism 2021-2025, which recommends that member states approve national plans by the end of 2022. And this national plan aims to materialize the right to equality and non-discrimination as the foundation of Portuguese democracy. through a strategy of national action, which reinforces the adoption of measures designed to prevent and combat racism transversally and in various sectors and governmental areas. As such, the national plan identifies 10 priority areas of intervention: governance, information and knowledge, education and culture, higher education, work and employment, housing, health and social action, justice, security and rights, participation and representation, sports, and means of communication and the digital. To conclude, it is clear that we need to continue increasing our capacity to prevent and combat racial discrimination, and also to develop new measures and adapt to the current context, namely through the important role of social media and online communication. And this also echoes common concerns worldwide on the matter of racism and xenophobia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, High Commissioner Pereira, for highlighting many of the good practices that you're involved in Portugal, including data collection, public information campaigns, as well as training. Regrettably, we don't have time for questions. And I would like to ask the organizers if they could compile all the good practices and recommendations that have been suggested throughout the day from these very rich contributions, so that they can be more widely disseminated to all the participants and beyond. And with that, I would like to thank the three panelists of the last panel and give the floor back to the organizers. And I thank you.
We just need 1 more minute. Thank you. As we approach the end of our event, we would like to thank you for your attention and hope you have found it useful and hopefully inspiring. We also express our gratitude to all our moderators and panelists, without whose participation this event would have been impossible. Their time, experience, and commitment are invaluable and highly appreciated. And now, to close the event, I have the honor to announce the Portuguese Minister of Justice, Francisca Van Dunen.
Good morning, everybody. It's an honor for me to close this conference, where protection against racial discrimination and related intolerance was addressed. This is a topic particularly important to me, both as a minister and as a citizen. Thinking, assessing, analyzing, and above all, publicly discussing the phenomenon of racism, xenophobia, and ethno-racial discrimination is an imperative need for an European society that has grown and diversified along ethnical, racial, and cultural lines. This is an important and timely initiative at a moment where we are witnessing in Europe radical movements fueled by hate speech, intolerance, and even violence against groups and sections of the population, including minorities and the most vulnerable people. The fight against all forms of discrimination is a cross-cutting priority of the European Presidency of the Council of the European Union, as set out in its programme. and it embodies in the protection of all persons and communities, the promotion of equal opportunities, the promotion of integration and response to the challenge of overcoming social stigmas, in line with the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations, the Council of Europe Convention for Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. The speakers made clear the role of education and educators in combating discrimination and promoting human rights, bringing to the attention of participants different perspectives of addressing this phenomenon, giving examples of good practices and programs aimed at protecting against discrimination. They spoke of the trends and challenges that still exist for the construction of an Europe united in diversity. Much has been done to prevent and combat discrimination, highlighting here the work of international organizations, such as the Office of Human Rights and Democratic Institutions of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and the European Union. I would recall, in the European context, the creation of a high-level group to combat racism, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance, the approval of a political declaration on combating anti-Semitism as an attack to the European values, and the recent EU Action Plan Against Racism 2020-2025, along with other initiatives in the area of anti-Gypsyism and anti-Muslimism. Equality and inclusion are two indispensable vectors of the road to building an Europe of freedom, of security and justice, an Europe that must show solidarity and be inclusive. To this, I would add integration and determination. Not only inclusion, but a true integration of all individuals in Europe, in the European society, regardless of their origin, regardless of their ethnicity or religious confessions, guaranteeing equal opportunities to all. And determination in the search for a better, for a more fair, for a more balanced and more participative society. In this equation, all sectors of society have a role to play, from governments to public institutions, civil society and the citizens. The prophecy that school, knowledge and culture would be in charge of resolving the issue of discrimination, racial, ethnic, or religious prejudice has not materialized. Today, in Europe, you have a population, and mainly the youngest, with a level of schooling much higher than that of previous generations. But does this fact mean that hate speech or reaction to racial, ethnic, or even religious difference has decreased? I would say no, unfortunately. On the contrary, a doctrine of demonization of the different, to which all of the weaknesses that plague our societies are associated, with a marked increase in xenophobic and racist manifestations fueled by narratives propagated through the social media. The Internet, characterized by immediacy and to a large extent by anonymity, being a largely unregulated domain, allows to amplify these manifestations and constitutes a privileged means for discrimination and radicalization. For this reason, we share the motto that has led the European response. What is considered illegal offline should also be considered illegal online. And consequently, it is essential to improve the ability to collect and preserve the evidence obtained in a digital environment, to bring to justice the authors of illegal conducts that undermine the foundations of our democracies. We must collectively make a commitment to combat racism in its different forms and xenophobia. As long as inequality based on race, ethnicity, origin, or religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity, or another inequality based on negative discrimination persists, we will have unequal societies and will not be possible to achieve full individual fulfillment and social peace. As long as discrimination treatment persists, inequality will persist. As long as inequality persists, the need to fight for the recognition and promotion of human rights will persist. The protection of minorities from racism and discrimination are strategic elements of a public policy based on human rights. It is essential to replace discriminations with openness and acceptance, to effectively combat hate speech and hate crimes, giving way to tolerance and respect for human dignity. Promote inclusive education, and, to quote European Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen, elevate diversity to a wonderful gift that makes Europe strong and resilient. The fight against discrimination and exclusion must remain on the political agenda of the European Union, as it is a fight that no state will be able to do or to win on its own in isolation. In an open and multicultural Europe, where freedom of movements and free residence are structural vectors, the adoption of common policies to combat social stigma is therefore essential. During this semester, the Portuguese Presidency has managed to reach the support of all Member States and to improve, in March, the Council conclusions on the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. We remain deeply committed to reaching agreement on the draft Council conclusions on the EU 2020 Citizenship Report, empowering citizens and their rights. We also look forward to the European Commission's initiative to extend the list of crimes provided for in Article 83 of the Treaty of Functioning of the European Union to include hate speech and hate crimes. In this long way, dialogue and sharing are fundamental. The exchange of views that took place here today, to this extent, was especially insensitive and enriching, also from the perspective of education and the promotion of historical awareness. And it is important because, quoting James Baldwin, one of the most influential voices of the civil rights movement in the United States, not everything we face can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Confrontation does not always bring a solution to the problem, but until we confront the problem, we will not have a solution. Therefore, we must continue faced to this reality and promote change, keep it on the international, European, and national agenda. We have to build solutions on shared values and to see diversity not as a threat, but rather an asset. This is what Europe and what European citizens expect from all of us. Thank you very much for being here today with us.